200 of the wealthiest people in the country watched a billionaire hand a mechanic a pile of rust and laugh about it. She called it a tip. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He just looked at the wreck, and something shifted behind his eyes that nobody in that room was paying enough attention to notice. They should have been paying attention, because what Isabella Sterling threw away like garbage was about to become the most valuable automotive discovery in 50 years. And the quiet man she humiliated was the only person on Earth who knew it. If you're watching this, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the very end. You won't regret it. The morning Ethan Walker's life changed forever. Started the same way every morning started, with burnt coffee and a 6-year-old who couldn't find her left shoe. "Daddy, it's not here." "Check under the couch." "I already checked under the couch." "Check again." Sophie Walker dropped to her knees on the linoleum floor with the theatrical suffering of someone 3 times her age, one arm disappearing beneath the sagging couch cushion. She came back up holding a purple sneaker, a dried-out marker, and what appeared to be a chicken nugget of uncertain age. "Found it," she announced. "Good. Throw that nugget away. It might still be good." "Sophie." "Fine." Ethan watched her dump it in the trash with the specific expression of someone surrendering something precious. Then he turned back to the coffee maker, which was doing its usual thing of brewing approximately 40% of what he actually needed. He topped off the mug with tap water, drank half of it standing at the counter, and told himself this was fine. This was just Tuesday. The shop opened at 8. It was currently 7:14, which meant he had exactly enough time to drop Sophie at Mrs. Delgado's next door, drive the 11 minutes to Walker Automotive Repair on Clement Street, and unlock the doors before his first appointment. A 2009 Honda Civic with a transmission that sounded like it was gargling gravel. He helped Sophie into her jacket, zipped it halfway because she insisted on doing the rest herself, and watched her fumble with the zipper pull for 45 seconds before he quietly took over. She let him because they'd been doing this long enough to know when to negotiate. "Mrs. Delgado has that show on again," Sophie said as they walked across the small patch of brown lawn between the houses. "The one with the singers." "You like that show?" "I like some of it. The sad parts are boring. The sad parts are usually the most important parts." She thought about that. "That's weird." "Yeah," he said. "It kind of is." Mrs. Delgado opened the door before they knocked. She always did, some combination of routine and the fact that her front window faced their yard directly. She was 63, retired, and had been watching Sophie 3 mornings a week for 2 years in exchange for Ethan fixing her ancient Buick LeSabre whenever it misbehaved, which was constantly. "Mija," she said, and Sophie walked past her knees straight toward the living room without ceremony. "Thank you," Ethan said. "She eat?" "Oatmeal." "She eat it or move it around the bowl?" He paused. "Both." Mrs. Delgado made a sound that communicated exactly what she thought of that, and Ethan walked back to his truck. The shop wasn't much. It sat between a dry cleaner and a closed-down print shop on a block that had been in the middle of becoming something better for about a decade without quite getting there. The sign above the door was hand-painted, Walker Automotive, in dark green letters on a white background, the paint starting to chip at the corners. Inside, it smelled like motor oil, metal, and the pine air freshener that Ethan had hung from the ceiling 3 months ago and forgotten about. 2 lifts, a parts wall, a small office with a desk covered in invoices, and a coffee maker that worked better than the one at home. His assistant, a 24-year-old named Marcus who had been just trying it out for a few months, for going on 2 years now, arrived at 8:07 looking like he hadn't slept. "You look like you haven't slept," Ethan said. "Stayed up watching that documentary about the Ferrari factory." "Which one?" "The new one. On that streaming thing." "Is it good?" Marcus dropped into the rolling stool near the parts wall. "It's incredible. Like, the way they talk about the engines, man, makes you feel bad for caring about anything else." Ethan smiled and didn't say anything. He had watched that documentary too 3 weeks ago, after Sophie fell asleep. He'd sat on the couch in the dark with his laptop and felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean word for. Nostalgia was too soft. Grief wasn't quite right either. It was more like recognizing the outline of a life you used to live. You ever think about doing restoration work again? Marcus asked. Not carelessly. He knew some of the history, enough to know it was a real question. Every day, Ethan said, and moved toward the Civic that was already up on the lift. Marcus let it go. He was good at knowing when to. The thing about working on regular cars, Civics and Corollas and F-150s with 180,000 miles and mystery vibrations, was that it required a different kind of attention than restoration work. Not lesser, just different. Restoration was archaeology. You worked backward through time, reading what the metal was telling you, understanding not just what was broken, but what the original builder had intended and whether those intentions could still be honored decades later. It required patience, scholarship, a certain willingness to listen to something that couldn't talk. General repair was more like emergency medicine. Fast decisions, practical solutions, the goal being to get something functional back out into the world rather than to understand it completely. Ethan was good at both. He'd just spent the last 6 years doing only one of them. He'd closed his restoration business the year Sophie's mother left. That was how he thought about it now, not in terms of choice, but in terms of sequence. Lauren left in April, and by June the restoration shop was gone too, because you couldn't run a business that required 60-hour weeks of careful, undivided focus when you had a newborn and no backup. He'd sold the equipment, closed the lease, and opened Walker Automotive Repair 8 months later with a loan he was still paying down. He didn't regret it. That was the truth. And it surprised him sometimes. He'd expected to carry the loss like a wound, but mostly he just carried it. It had become part of his weight without being the thing that broke him. Though there were moments, a particular sound, or the smell of old metal, or watching that documentary in the dark, when he felt the full distance of what he'd stepped away from. Marcus called from under the Civic, "This transmission is done, man! Like, done. I know. We telling the owner? We're telling the owner. She's going to be upset. She's got a 2009 Civic with 220,000 miles. She should have been expecting this conversation for about 4 years. Still going to be upset." Yeah, Ethan agreed. People don't like hearing that something they were counting on isn't what they thought it was. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday. It came as an email, which seemed wrong for something that was apparently supposed to be prestigious. The subject line read, "Sterling Foundation Annual Gala, Service Personnel Confirmation," and Ethan almost deleted it before he realized it was from the caterer he did occasional work for. His shop was listed in their vendor network for on-site mechanical support at large events. People at these things sometimes needed jump starts, tire changes, the occasional minor crisis resolved quietly, so no one had to feel embarrassed in their formal wear. He'd done it twice before. It paid well for a few hours of work. It was usually boring, and he got to spend the evening standing near expensive cars, which was its own reward. He confirmed the booking and didn't think about it again for 10 days. The Sterling Foundation Gala was held at the Ashbrook Estate on the edge of the city, a property that had been built in the 1920s by someone with more money than taste, then renovated in the 1980s by someone with different money and similar taste, and finally purchased 15 years ago by Richard Sterling, who had made his fortune in commercial real estate and private equity, and whose idea of a charitable legacy was hosting one very large party per year and writing the check that followed. Richard Sterling had died 8 months before the gala in question, leaving behind a foundation, a daughter, and the specific kind of grief that comes from losing someone complicated. Ethan didn't know any of this when he pulled his truck through the service entrance at 5:30 on a Saturday evening. He knew the address, the contact name, a woman named Patricia who ran logistics for the catering company, and the fact that he was expected to stay until 11 and be useful if needed. Patricia met him at the service gate. She was brisk, efficient, and was holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Walker? That's me. You're parked around back with the other support vehicles. Event starts at 7, guests until midnight. Main thing we need is you visible but not visible. You understand? If somebody's got a flat or a dead battery, you fix it fast and quiet. No drama." "Got it." "You need dinner. There's a staff table in the kitchen from 6 to 7. Don't be in the main hall before setup's complete." "Understood." She was already walking away. Ethan parked his truck, changed into his clean work shirt in the cab, and spent the next hour and a half reading on his phone and watching the event staff move with the coordinated urgency of people who did this professionally. At 6:15, he ate a plate of salmon and roasted vegetables at the staff table alongside a bartender named Dex and two servers who talked exclusively to each other about a reality show Ethan had never heard of. He ate quickly, thanked the kitchen staff, and went back outside. That was when he saw the car. It was in a storage area adjacent to the main garage, a large outbuilding set back from the main house, its doors partially open. Someone had left a work light on inside, the kind that throws a pale yellow glow and makes everything look both more and less real. Ethan wasn't looking for it. He was walking back to his truck from the kitchen entrance, taking a shortcut between buildings, and the light caught the edge of something and his feet simply stopped. Later, he wouldn't be able to explain why exactly. There was nothing obviously compelling about what he saw. It was to any reasonable observer a ruined car, a hulk of corroded metal sitting on 4 flat tires, its body buckled in places, its surface consumed by decades of rust. It looked like something that should have been scrapped 30 years ago and somehow never was. But the shape of it stopped him. He stood in the gap between the buildings for a moment, then walked toward the storage area like he'd been asked to, like it made obvious sense, like there was any logic to what he was doing at all. Up close, it was worse and better than he'd thought. The rust was severe, the kind that came from long-term improper storage, probably moisture exposure over decades. Whoever had kept this hadn't kept it well. The wheels were gone under flat, cracked tires. A section of the front bodywork was caved in from what looked like an old impact. The interior was barely visible through the dirt-caked windows, but he could see that it had been stripped at some point. Seats gone, most of the dashboard missing. None of that was what he was looking at. He was looking at the bodywork itself, the panels. He crouched near the front wheel arch and brought out his phone's flashlight, hand-formed aluminum. He could see it under the rust, the slight irregularity of hand-hammered metal versus stamped production panels. The radius of the wheel arch, the way it transitioned into the front fender, it wasn't the work of a factory line. This was coach-built. Someone had shaped this body by hand, panel by panel, over a frame. In 2025, that was unusual. In whatever decade this car was built, it suggested a very specific kind of manufacturer. He stood up and walked around to the rear. The tail treatment, the proportions of the greenhouse, the angle of the rear glass where it met the trunk lid. His mind was pulling at something, a specific memory, a photograph in a book, an auction catalog from years ago, a conversation with an old colleague in Geneva about a particular coach builder in northern Italy whose work in the 1960s was so distinctive that you only needed to see a section of a panel to know. He made himself slow down. He was jumping. He was getting ahead of the evidence. He'd been standing here for 4 minutes, and he was already constructing a narrative that would be embarrassing if he was wrong. He took 3 photographs with his phone. He measured the wheelbase by pacing it, approximately 9 feet. He photographed the cowl, the door seam, the rear haunches. Then he stood back and let himself feel the thing he'd been holding back. The silhouette. It was that more than anything. The shape the car made against the work light. The long hood, the short tail, the low roofline, the almost aggressive lean of the rear pillar. He had seen this shape before. Not on the street, not in any showroom, not in any museum. In a photograph. A black and white photograph printed in a 1974 issue of a European automotive journal that his mentor, a retired coach builder named Karl Bauer, had kept in a cardboard box in his workshop in Stuttgart. The photograph showed a car that had disappeared from the automotive world in 1971. "Hey," he turned. A man in event staff clothing was standing at the edge of the storage building, frowning. "You're not supposed to be in here." "Sorry," Ethan said, completely calm. "I was checking the perimeter. I'm with the vehicle support team, saw the lights were on and wanted to make sure everything was secure." It wasn't a great lie, but the man looked tired and had 17 other things to worry about, and after a moment he just said, "Leave it," and walked away. Ethan took one last look at the car. "Okay," he said quietly, to no one. Then he went back to work. He didn't sleep much that night. He got home at 11:40, paid Mrs. Delgado's teenage granddaughter, who'd been sitting with Sophie, looked in on his daughter sleeping in her bed with one arm around a stuffed elephant named Gerald, and then sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop. He told himself he was going to spend 20 minutes checking his theory and then go to bed. It was 3:40 in the morning when he finally closed the screen. The images he'd taken at the estate weren't great. Low light, taken fast, not exactly the documentation a professional appraiser would use. But they were enough to work with, and the more he studied them against the reference material he was pulling from his files, old photographs, archived auction catalogs, a digitized copy of Carl Bauer's private notes that Carl had sent him years ago as a goodbye gift when his eyesight got bad, the more certain he became. The specific proportions of that rear three-quarter view, the seam treatment on the doors, the particular way the coach builder had handled the transition from the roof to the C-pillar, a technique that was almost a fingerprint. He made a list. Then he made another list of all the reasons he could be wrong. The second list was shorter. He opened a browser and typed a name into the search bar. Stellarini Carrozzeria. The results were sparse because this was a name that existed mostly in specialist literature, not in the pages of mainstream automotive journalism. Stellarini had operated out of a small workshop near Brescia, Italy, between 1955 and 1973. Their total production, across all commission work, had been fewer than 40 vehicles. Of those, fewer than 20 were known to have survived. Once, the one that collectors and historians had been quietly looking for since the early 1970s, had never been found. A 1968 commission. A single car built to a private specification for a wealthy buyer whose identity had remained unclear. The car had been documented in Stellarini's workshop records, delivered, and then effectively vanished from any paper trail. 2 photographs existed, one taken at the workshop before delivery, one taken at an event in Monaco in 1969. After that, nothing. The automotive historical community had spent decades assuming it was either destroyed or sitting in a private collection somewhere in Europe, accessible only to its owner and no one else. The possibility that it had ended up in a storage building in the United States, deteriorating in the dark, was, objectively, one of the stranger outcomes. But stranger things had happened. Ethan knew that. He knew cases where historically significant cars had been discovered in barns and shipping containers, in the back lots of dealerships that changed hands, and no one inventoried the contents. Objects moved through the world in strange ways. They got sold by estates that didn't know what they had, shipped across oceans for reasons that made sense at the time, and forgotten by the people who forgot them. He wrote down the names of 3 people he needed to call. Carl Bauer in Stuttgart. If he was still sharp enough. He'd be 78 now, and his eyesight was gone, but his memory was a different story. A woman named Dr. Renata Voss in Vienna, who was the foremost living expert on Italian coach building of that era, and who had co-authored the definitive catalog of Stellarini's known work, and an automotive historian in Boston named James Pruitt, who Ethan had worked with once, 8 years ago, on an authentication case involving an Alfa Romeo that had turned out to be exactly what the seller claimed, and not the fraud Pruitt's client had suspected. He looked at the clock. 3:42. He had to be at the shop by 8. He went to bed. He lay there for about 20 minutes with his eyes open, listening to the sound of the house settling in the dark before he fell asleep. The call with Carl Bauer happened 3 days later. It took 2 attempts to reach him. Carl didn't own a smartphone, and his landline sometimes went to a voicemail that was full, and his daughter had to relay a message through a neighbor. But on Thursday afternoon, Ethan's phone rang with an international number and Carl's voice came through, scratchy with distance and age, but unmistakably his. "Ethan Walker, I thought you'd become a mechanic." "I am a mechanic." "You were never a mechanic. What do you need?" Ethan had the photographs open on his laptop. He described what he was seeing in as much technical detail as he could manage. The wheel arch radius, the door seam treatment, the roofline geometry, the rear pillar angle, without telling Carl what he thought yet. He wanted Carl's reaction clean, unprompted. There was a long silence on the other end. "Say again what you said about the C-pillar," Carl said. Ethan described it again. Another silence, longer. "Where are you seeing this?" "A private property in the United States. The car's been in storage. It's in bad condition." "How bad?" Severe corrosion, body damage in the front, interior stripped. But the panels themselves, what I can see of them, the metalwork is intact under the rust. Ethan. Carl's voice had changed. Something careful had come into it. The photographs you described of the C-pillar treatment, that was a technique I saw used in only one workshop in my entire career. I know. And I only saw it used on one car. I know, Ethan said. The line crackled. You can't be serious. I'm serious enough to call you at 3 a.m. your time. Carl made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. You need Renata. I know. I'm calling her tomorrow. She's going to think you've lost your mind. Probably. And if you haven't lost your mind, then we need to do this right, properly, with documentation and process and people who can stand behind an authentication. Ethan paused. I just needed someone to tell me I wasn't seeing things. Another long silence. You're not seeing things, Carl Bauer said quietly. Or if you are, you're seeing the same things I would. Dr. Renata Voss was harder to convince. She was rigorous in the specific way that serious scholars are. Not hostile, but genuinely resistant to the idea that something as significant as what Ethan was suggesting could have survived undetected for this long. She listened to his description with the controlled skepticism of someone who'd been chasing down false leads in this field for 30 years. The C-pillar angle you're describing could be consistent with several European coach builders of that period, she said, not just Stellarini. I know. That's why I want to talk about the door seam treatment. A pause. Go on. He described it. She was quiet for longer than was comfortable. That's a very specific technique, she said finally. Yes. And the wheel arch. The radius and the transition into the fender. It's not a production technique. She was quiet again. He could hear her breathing. Where's this car? She asked. It's at a private estate outside the city. I don't have access to it. I saw it by chance. Who owns the estate? The Sterling family. The father died. The daughter inherited. And they don't know what they have. As far as I can tell, they think it's scrap. Dr. Voss made a sound that he couldn't quite categorize. If you're right, she said, and I want to be extremely clear that I am not saying you are right. If you're right, we're talking about the most significant automotive discovery in at least 2 decades, possibly longer. I know. This cannot be rushed. Documentation, provenance research, the authentication process needs to be... I know how it needs to be done, Ethan said. I've done this before. She paused. Yes, I remember. The Ravenna Commission in 2016. This is bigger than that. I understand that. She paused again. I'll need to see photographs. Good ones, not phone snapshots, and I'll need to contact James Pruitt. I'm already talking to James. Of course you are. She was quiet for a moment. How did you find this car? By accident. I was working an event at the estate. As what? He hesitated for only a moment. Vehicle support. He let that sit without explanation, and she didn't ask for one, but he heard something shift in her tone. Not pity, exactly, more like a quiet recalibration. Get me better photographs, she said, and access to the car, whatever it takes. Getting access was the problem he hadn't solved yet. The car was on private property he had no legitimate reason to be on. The owner, Isabella Sterling, was not someone he knew or had any connection to, and his only point of contact at the estate was Patricia, the logistics coordinator, who had zero authority over what was kept in the storage buildings and exactly zero interest in his automotive theories. He sat with this problem for 2 days. The solution came from an unlikely direction, the gala itself. Patricia called him on a Thursday to ask if he was available for a follow-up event, a smaller one, a private dinner the Sterling Foundation was hosting for major donors the following weekend. Could he be there? He said yes, immediately. He spent the week between the events preparing. He printed what documentation he had, made a folder of reference photographs and technical specifications, and practiced in his head what he was going to say and to whom. He was aware that he had no standing for this approach, that walking up to a billionaire at her family's dinner party and telling her that the rusty car in her storage building might be worth $9 million was not a normal thing to do, and would likely be received with varying degrees of irritation. But the car was deteriorating. Every month it sat in improper storage was damage that couldn't be undone. He felt a specific urgency about that, not just professionally, but in the way you feel when you're watching something irreplaceable come apart and the clock is ticking. He arrived at the estate on Saturday evening and did exactly what he was paid to do for the first 2 hours. He stayed near the vehicles, he stayed quiet, and he waited. Isabella Sterling was not easy to get a read on, even from a distance. She moved through the dinner party with the kind of practiced ease that looked natural until you looked long enough to see the effort underneath it. She was around 30, dark-haired, wearing something simple and expensive that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. She laughed at the right moments and listened at others and managed to seem fully present in about 6 conversations simultaneously. She was grieving, he realized. Not ostentatiously, nothing in her manner invited acknowledgement or sympathy, but it was there in the way she sometimes went very still for a second, like a frame catching in a reel, before she resumed. He recognized it because he knew what that kind of quiet grief looked like. He'd worn it himself. He waited until the dinner moved inside and the terrace was mostly empty before he approached the estate's house manager, a thin man named George, who had been coordinating events here long enough to know where all the literal and figurative bodies were buried. "The storage building out by the main garage," Ethan said, keeping his voice casual. "The car in there. Do you know anything about its history?" George looked at him with mild suspicion. "Why?" "I caught a glimpse of it when I was here last week. It's a professional curiosity. I used to do restoration work." George's expression softened slightly, the way people's expressions do when they're about to tell a story they don't usually get to tell. "Mr. Sterling brought it over from Europe. Long time ago. Must be 20 years at least. Had some idea of restoring it himself, but it never happened. After he got sick, the whole thing just sat." "Do you know where he got it?" "Not specifically. I know he went to a lot of auctions, estate sales in Europe, that kind of thing. He had a genuine passion for old cars, shaped not just as investments. He actually cared about them." George paused. "More than most people here understood, I think." Ethan thanked him and stood there for a moment after George moved away, looking across the dark lawn toward the outbuilding. 20 years. Richard Sterling had owned that car for 20 years and never done anything with it. The question was whether Isabella Sterling even knew what her father had been sitting on. He got his answer 40 minutes later, in a way he hadn't planned for. The dinner was winding down when Isabella Sterling came out to the terrace for air. She didn't seem to notice Ethan at first. He was standing near the far edge, near the pathway that ran along the building's side, and the terrace lighting left that corner in relative shadow. She stood at the railing with a glass of white wine she wasn't drinking much of, looking out at the grounds with the expression of someone doing mental math on a number that kept coming out wrong. He should have stayed quiet, should have waited for a better moment, a more appropriate channel, a formal introduction. Instead, he said, "The car in the storage building. Do you know what it might be?" She turned. Her expression moved through surprise and landed on something cooler. "I'm sorry?" "The car in the outbuilding by the garage, the old one. Do you have any documentation for it? Registration, provenance records, anything your father might have kept?" She stared at him for a moment. He was aware of how this looked. A man in a work shirt, someone who had driven here in a truck that had a dent in the front bumper, approaching her in the dark to ask questions about her dead father's property. "Who are you?" she said. "Ethan Walker. I'm with the vehicle support team. I've been here twice now for your events." "Okay." She didn't sound hostile so much as guarded. "Why are you asking about a rusty car in my storage building?" He told her as simply and directly as he could that he had seen the car, that the bodywork had indicated to him, based on his professional background, that it might not be what it appeared, that he had since consulted with colleagues whose expertise in European coach building was among the most respected in the world, and that while nothing was confirmed, the preliminary evidence suggested the car could be historically significant. Isabella Sterling listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The car is a wreck. My father clearly wasted money on it and never got around to doing anything with it. If you're suggesting it has value, I'm not suggesting anything definitively. I'm saying the evidence is worth taking seriously. You're a mechanic. He absorbed that. I used to run one of the most respected classic car restoration businesses in the country. I closed it 6 years ago for personal reasons. My professional background in this specific area. I'm sure it's very impressive, she said, in a tone that made clear she did not find it impressive, that she found the entire conversation mildly presumptuous and somewhat uncomfortable and would like it to conclude. He handed her the folder he'd put together. She took it with visible reluctance. The reference photographs are in there, he said. The technical documentation, the names of the experts I've been in contact with. You don't have to take my word for it. The materials speak for themselves. She looked at the folder. I'm asking you to consider having the car professionally assessed before doing anything else with it, he said. That's all. She didn't respond. He took that as his cue to step back, to retreat to the darkness at the edge of the terrace, to resume his role as someone who was there to be useful and invisible. He drove home that night not knowing if she'd opened the folder or put it in recycling. He found out 4 days later when she called. I looked at what you gave me, she said, without preamble. Okay. The photographs? The technical material. I had my assistant call someone at Brentford's, the auction house, and they confirmed that the names you mentioned are legitimate. They are. Dr. Voss especially, apparently. A pause. She's quite eminent. Yes. Another pause. Longer. Can you arrange for the assessment to happen? The authentication process, whatever it's called? Ethan felt something settle in his chest. Yes. I want it done properly. I don't want this turned into some kind of media event. My father just died and I have enough... She stopped, started again. I want it handled professionally. That's exactly how it should be handled. And Mr. Walker... Her voice was careful now, measured. If this turns out to be nothing, if my father just bought a rusty piece of junk that a clever person convinced him was something valuable, then you'll know, Ethan said. And that's worth knowing too. She was quiet for a moment, then, fine, set it up. 3 weeks was how long it took to coordinate the authentication. It took 2 weeks just to get Dr. Voss and her colleague, a photogrammetry specialist from the Stuttgart Institute, to confirm their availability and get visas processed. James Pruitt's schedule needed adjustment. The estate had to be made available on specific dates. Proper lighting had to be arranged. Ethan spent significant portions of those 3 weeks on the phone and email coordinating logistics he wasn't being paid for during hours that stretched past midnight on multiple nights. Sophie, who understood more than she let on, started asking if he was okay. I'm fine, Soph. You're on the phone all the time. I know, just for a little while longer. Is it about the old car? He looked at her. What do you know about an old car? She shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a child who has been listening through walls. You said to Mrs. Delgado it was possibly the most important thing you'd ever seen, and that you needed to handle it right. He made a mental note to have conversations at a lower volume. It's a very old car that might be very important, he said. I'm trying to help figure that out. How old? About 60 years. She considered this. That's really old. Really is. Is it broken? Yes, badly. Can you fix it? He was quiet for a second. That's not really my job on this one. Then what's your job? He thought about it. To make sure the right people see it, he said. Consent. The team arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November. Dr. Voss flew in from Vienna, accompanied by her photogrammetry colleague, Dr. Henrik Strauss. James Pruitt drove up from Boston the night before and met Ethan for coffee at 7 in the morning, looking like a man who'd been thinking hard about something for 3 weeks. Tell me you didn't drag me out here for nothing, James said. When have I dragged you out for nothing? Never. That's why I'm nervous. Isabella Sterling met them at the estate gate with a formality that Ethan recognized as a kind of protection. She was keeping herself controlled, not quite detached, because the alternative was feeling too much about something she wasn't sure deserved to be felt about yet. She shook everyone's hands. She showed them to the storage building. She had arranged for it to be properly lit overnight, banks of LED work lights that turned the space from a dark, damp outbuilding into something that resembled a clinical examination room. In that light, the car looked different. Not better, exactly. The rust was the same, the damage was the same, but the shape of it, which had caught Ethan's eye in that first accidental moment, was now fully visible without shadows to soften or confuse. Dr. Voss walked around it 3 times without speaking. James Pruitt crouched near the rear quarter panel with a flashlight, then stood up and walked to the front. Dr. Strauss set up his photogrammetry equipment with the methodical calm of someone performing a surgery. Ethan stood near the wall and watched. Isabella was beside him, her arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral. "How long?" she asked quietly. "The initial assessment, a few hours. The definitive authentication will take longer. We'll need to do paint analysis, metal composition work, provenance research. But you'll know something today. Dr. Voss will know something today," he said. "I already think I know." She glanced at him sideways. "That confident?" "I've been wrong before," he said, "but not about something I've thought about this carefully for this long." She looked back at the car. "My father loved old things," she said after a moment. Not warmly, not coldly. It was an observation delivered with the mixed feeling of someone processing a complicated person. He'd go to these auctions in Europe and come back with things that didn't seem worth the trouble. Old clocks, furniture, documents. Once a whole crate of botanical drawings from the 1800s. He'd spend weeks researching them. Did he know about cars specifically? He knew enough to know what he didn't know, which is more than most people. She paused. He talked about this car sometimes. He said he'd bought it because something about it felt important, but he couldn't articulate what. He didn't have the expertise. Ethan was quiet. "I thought he'd wasted money," she said. "I thought it was another one of his projects that was never going to happen. And after he got sick, it just..." She stopped. "It sat." "He was right about it," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Whatever the formal authentication determines," he said, "whatever the official conclusion is, your father was right. He found something. He knew it without being able to prove it." Isabella Sterling looked back at the car for a long moment, and her face did something complicated that she didn't quite manage to control. Then Dr. Voss called from across the room. "Mr. Walker?" Her voice was carefully even. "Come here, please." He crossed the space. She was crouched near the rear wheel arch, her flashlight directed at a section where the rust had been carefully removed to reveal the aluminum beneath. In the light, faint marks were visible in the metal, the marks of a specific hammer, used in a specific way, by specific hands. She looked up at him. "I've seen these marks twice in my career," she said. "Once on a vehicle at the Pinacoteca di Brescia. Once on a car that sold at Geneva in 2019 for 4.3 million euros. The room was very quiet. "Both of those were confirmed Stellarini commissions," she said. Ethan crouched down beside her and looked at the marks. He had been carrying this possibility for 3 weeks. He had held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile, because being wrong would have meant something, not just professionally, but personally, in ways that were harder to name. He looked at the hammer marks in the old aluminum. He wasn't wrong. "Okay," he said softly. From across the room he heard Isabella Sterling say, "What does that mean?" Dr. Voss stood up. "It means," she said, with the measured precision of someone who had been in this field long enough to know that measured precision was required, "that we have a great deal of work still to do, but it also means that your storage building has been keeping a secret for a very long time." Isabella stared at her. "What kind of secret?" Dr. Voss looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the car. "The kind," he said, "that changes things." The drive home from the estate that Tuesday evening took 40 minutes longer than usual because of a backup on the highway, and Ethan sat in the stopped traffic with his hands on the wheel and the radio off, replaying the last 4 hours in his head. Dr. Voss had been precise and controlled for the remainder of the assessment, which was the professional thing to be, the necessary thing to be, and Ethan understood that. Authentication wasn't built on gut feeling and visible excitement. It was built on documentation, repetition, corroboration, the slow accumulation of evidence that could withstand challenge from people who would absolutely try to challenge it. You didn't announce a discovery of this magnitude on the basis of one afternoon with work lights and a flashlight. But he had watched Dr. Voss's face when she was crouched near that wheel arch, when the hammer marks were visible in the aluminum, and he knew what he'd seen there. She was a serious scholar who had spent 30 years in a field that was full of false claims and wishful thinking and outright fraud, and she had learned a long time ago to keep her reactions in a controlled place where they couldn't embarrass her. What was underneath that control had been something else entirely. He got home at 8:15. Sophie was already in bed. Mrs. Delgado had brought her over at 7 and put her down with what she described as some resistance, which Ethan translated to mean Sophie had negotiated an extra 20 minutes of television by claiming a stomachache that both she and Mrs. Delgado had probably understood was fictional. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. She was asleep on her side, one arm around Gerald the elephant, her hair going in about 4 directions at once. Her nightlight threw a pale orange glow across the ceiling that had been there so long it had become part of how that room looked, what that room meant. He was tired in a specific way that felt different from regular tired, the kind that came from carrying something significant around in your nervous system for weeks, and then watching it begin to be confirmed in real time. Not relief exactly, more like the sensation of a long-held breath beginning to release. He went to the kitchen, made a sandwich he ate standing at the counter, and then opened his laptop. There were 4 emails from James Pruitt. He read them in order. The first was sent at 4:30 from the estate while they were still on site. It contained only a single line. "I need you to know I am extremely annoyed at how right you appear to be." The second, sent at 6, was more detailed. James had used the photogrammetry data Dr. Strauss had collected to begin a dimensional analysis. The wheelbase measurement, the overall length, the specific ratios of the greenhouse, they were mapping almost exactly to the workshop documentation that existed for the 1968 Stellarini Commission. Not approximately, almost exactly. The kind of precision that couldn't be coincidence. The third email contained a scanned document that James had photographed on his phone, barely legible but readable if you squinted and knew what you were looking for. It was a page from what appeared to be a dealer's invoice, handwritten in Italian, dated 1969. James had found it folded inside a rubber-banded collection of papers in a cardboard box in the corner of the storage building, papers that had been sitting there apparently untouched for years, possibly decades. The invoice referenced a vehicle number. James had cross-referenced that number with the partial chassis plate that Dr. Strauss had managed to locate under the rear seat mounting bracket, obscured by decades of grime. They matched. The fourth email was short. "Call me in the morning. We need to talk about how to handle the next steps very carefully." Ethan read that last email twice, then closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table without moving for a while. He thought about Richard Sterling, a man he'd never met, who had brought this car across an ocean because something about it felt important, who had meant to restore it and never did, whose life got complicated and then shortened, who had died 8 months ago without ever knowing what he'd actually found. He thought about Isabella Sterling, who had inherited a father's unfinished work without the context to understand what any of it meant, who had stood in that storage building this afternoon with her arms crossed and her face controlled and her grief doing that thing grief did, sitting inside ordinary moments like a weight you'd stopped noticing. He thought about Sophie asleep in the next room with her arm around a stuffed elephant. Then he went to bed. He slept, which surprised him a little. But the call with James happened the next morning at 7, while Ethan was in the shop parking lot eating a breakfast sandwich from the place 2 blocks over that used too much butter on the bread, but got away with it. "Okay," James said, "here's where we are. The dimensional analysis is strong. The chassis number match is very strong. Voss is in contact with the Stellarini archive in Brescia. There's a private foundation that holds the workshop records, and she's requesting the original commission file." "How long for that?" "Weeks, potentially. The foundation is meticulous, and they're not going to rush for anyone." A pause. "Which is right. That's how it should be." "I know." "The paint analysis is going to take time, too. Strauss took samples back to Stuttgart. We're looking at a minimum of 3 weeks for the full spectrographic work." Ethan took a bite of his sandwich. "What's your read, James? Not the formal read. Your actual read." A long pause. "My actual read, James said slowly, is that I've been doing this for 22 years, and I've only felt this way 3 times. Once was the Benedetti Alpha in 2009. Once was the Carrere Commission we authenticated in 2018. Both of those turned out to be exactly what we thought they were. And the third time? The Morgenstern case in 2014, I was wrong about that one. How wrong? Completely wrong. Spectacular failure. Don't bring it up at conferences. He paused. But this isn't that. The Morgenstern case had problems in the dimensional data that I explained away because I wanted to be right. This one, but the data isn't asking me to explain anything. It's just sitting there looking at me. Ethan finished the sandwich. What does Voss say officially? Officially, she's being appropriately cautious. But she called me at 10 last night to tell me that she'd spent 3 hours looking at the photogrammetry data and had decided she needed a glass of wine. That's as close to confirmation as she gets. That's basically her popping champagne. James was quiet for a moment. There's also the question of the Sterling estate's handling of this. How's the daughter? Ethan considered it. Guarded? Processing? Does she understand what we might be looking at in terms of value? Not fully. We haven't talked numbers. You're going to have to, and she's going to need legal counsel before any of this goes public. If the authentication holds, she's sitting on something that's going to attract serious attention from collectors, from institutions, probably from the press. I know. Who manages that for her? That's her problem to figure out. Our job is the authentication. Right. James paused. Ethan, how are you doing with this? The question was genuine enough that it caught him slightly off guard. He looked out the windshield at the front of his shop, the green sign, the chip in the paint at the corner. I'm fine. You spent 6 years fixing Civics and Corollas. You stumble onto what might be the most significant automotive find in 2 decades. I'm fine, James. Because you can feel more than one thing about it, you know. I know. He paused. I'll call you tomorrow. He got out of the truck and went to unlock the shop, and Marcus pulled in 30 seconds later looking considerably more awake than usual. You look different, Marcus said. Different how? I don't know. Like something happened. Something's happening, Ethan said. I'll tell you about it when I can. Marcus looked at him for a moment, then nodded with the easy acceptance of someone who'd learned not to push. Cool. The Matos Silverado came in early, by the way. The brake situation is worse than we thought. Of course it is, Ethan said, and went to look at the Silverado. He didn't see Isabella Sterling for 9 days. She called twice during that period, once to ask about the timeline on the formal authentication, once to ask a question about the provenance documentation that she could have asked James just as easily, but apparently didn't. He answered both calls with the same direct, practical register he'd been using with her from the start, and she responded the same way. And there was nothing remarkable about either conversation, except that at the end of the second one she said, almost as an afterthought, George told me you came back and looked at the car again, after the assessment. He had in fact gone back to the estate the previous Thursday, during the day with better photographic equipment borrowed from a friend who did architectural work. Isabella's assistant had arranged access, and he'd spent 3 hours carefully documenting every panel, every seam, every piece of surviving detail. He hadn't thought Isabella would necessarily know about it. I wanted better documentation, he said. I know, I saw the photographs you sent Voss. A pause. They're very thorough. I was thorough. Another pause. Thank you, she said in a voice that suggested it cost her something small to say it. It's the work, he said, and meant it. After he hung up, Marcus, who had been pretending not to listen from behind the open hood of a Subaru, said, Is that the billionaire lady? She's not. He stopped. Her name is Ms. Sterling. Right. Marcus was grinning. The billionaire. Get back to work. The 9 days were productive in the ways that mattered. Dr. Voss received a preliminary response from the Stellarini archive. Not the full commission file, but a confirmation that a 1968 commission corresponding to the vehicle number existed in their records. That confirmation was the difference between a strong hypothesis and something that was beginning to look, formally, like a probable fact. Ethan drafted a progress summary and sent it to Isabella's assistant. He didn't know if she read it herself or had someone summarize it for her. He assumed she read it because the follow-up questions that came back 2 days later were specific and detailed and showed an understanding of the process that didn't come from having someone else explain it. She was paying attention. That mattered. What he hadn't anticipated was the leak. He found out on a Thursday morning, the same way he found out most things he hadn't anticipated, through a phone call from James Pruitt at an hour that indicated James was not happy. "Someone talked," James said. Ethan set down his coffee. "What?" "There's a piece on a collector's forum, one of those authentication watch sites that the specialist community uses. It's vague, but it's specific enough. Someone who was at the estate, or connected to someone who was, posted about a potential major Stellarini discovery in the United States." How specific is vague? Vague enough that they don't have the details. Specific enough that the people who matter will start making calls. Ethan absorbed this. Who posted it? Unknown account could be anyone, though. Estate staff, someone who saw the authentication team arriving. Could even be someone in our network, which is a terrible thought I'm going to not think about. James paused. The point is, the information is moving. We have maybe a week, 10 days before someone with resources starts trying to verify it and things get complicated. We need to accelerate the formal process. Yes, and Isabella Sterling needs to get ahead of this. If this becomes a story before we have the authentication complete, it's going to be messy. Ethan was already reaching for his jacket. "I'll call her." "Ethan," James's voice was careful. "When you call her, she's going to be upset about the leak, about the timeline pressure. Don't let her make any public statements until she has legal counsel in place." "I know." "And try to... Look, just be careful about how you handle this with her. She's in a position where she needs good advice, and she's probably not used to getting it from someone in your..." He stopped. "In my what?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice even. James was quiet for a second. "In your current position." Ethan let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "I'll call you after I talk to her," and hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a second. He wasn't angry exactly. He understood what James meant, understood the class mechanics of it, the way the world automatically sorted people by visible markers and adjusted its expectations accordingly. He'd lived in those mechanics long enough to know how they worked. It didn't make them less irritating. He called Isabella Sterling. Her assistant picked up, but Isabella was on the other line within 90 seconds, which told him something about how alert she was to anything related to the car. "Mr. Walker." "There's been a leak," he said. "Information about the possible Stellarini discovery is circulating in specialist circles. It's vague right now, but that won't last." A pause. When she spoke, her voice was controlled, but tight. "Who leaked it?" "We don't know. Could be anyone with peripheral knowledge of the authentication visit. I need to know who..." "With respect, right now that's less important than managing what comes next," he said. "The specialist community moves fast when something like this surfaces. You're going to start getting calls from collectors, dealers, possibly journalists who cover the high-end market. You need legal counsel in place before any of that happens. I have lawyers. You need someone who specifically understands cultural property law and art authentication disputes. Your corporate lawyers may not have that background." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you have a name?" He gave her a name. A woman named Patricia Crane in New York, who had handled 2 of the authentication cases he'd been involved with years ago, and who was as good as anyone in the country at this kind of work. "I'll have my assistant reach out today," Isabella said. "Good." He paused. "The other thing, I'd recommend against making any public statement until the formal authentication is complete, not even something general. Anything you say right now gets used to fill in the blanks that the speculation is already creating." "So I say nothing." "You say nothing." "That's going to be difficult when people start calling." "I know." He paused. "Do you want me to be a point of contact for specialist inquiries? I can screen them, give you assessments of who's credible and who's phishing." Another silence. He couldn't read it. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You're already..." She stopped. "You're not being paid for any of this." "No." "So why..." Because the car deserves to be handled correctly, he said. Because your father spent 20 years keeping something safe without knowing exactly what it was, and the last thing it needs is for the discovery process to get contaminated by a leak and a rush to capitalize. He paused. And because I started this, I want to see it finished right. Another silence, longer. All right, she said. Yes, I'd appreciate that. The calls started within 48 hours. Ethan fielded 7 in the first 2 days. 3 from dealers who framed their inquiry as concern for proper authentication and were almost certainly scoping the potential for acquisition, 2 from collectors who were more direct about their interest, 1 from a journalist at an automotive trade publication who was extremely charming and received no useful information, and 1 from a man who identified himself as representing a European consortium and who offered to make what he called a preliminary expression of interest before authentication was complete. Ethan handled each call with the same even, unrevealing manner, took notes on all of them, and sent Isabella a summary each evening. On the 3rd evening, she called him back directly instead of going through her assistant. The consortium call, she said. What did they actually want? Exactly what it sounded like. They want first access to the car if the authentication confirms. They're pre-positioning. Before we even know what it is? That's how this market works at the high end. The significant money moves early. And if the authentication fails, if it turns out my father bought an expensive antique nobody cares about, then the consortium has no interest and neither does anyone else. He paused. But that's not what's going to happen. You're that certain. I'm that certain. She was quiet for a moment. I've been doing research, she said, on Stellarini, on the history of this kind of work. I found a catalog of their known productions. Voss and another scholar co-authored it. 12 years ago, I have a copy. The photographs in it, she paused. The way those cars looked. The lines. He waited. My father had a print in his office, she said. I always thought it was a sketch, like a design drawing for something that never got built. It was on the wall for as long as I can remember. Something shifted slightly in Ethan's understanding of things. Do you still have it? It's still in his office. I haven't really gone through his office. Would you look at it? Tell me what's in the bottom right corner, if there's any text or marking. He heard her moving, a door, footsteps on what sounded like hardwood, the soft sound of something being taken from a wall. Then, it says Stellarini Carrozzeria, 1968, and a number, B-04. The room Ethan was standing in, his kitchen, 11 at night, Sophie asleep, the familiar low hum of the refrigerator, seemed to take on a different quality. B-04. That was the workshop designation for the 1968 commission, the one in the archive records, the one that matched the chassis number on the car in her storage building. Your father knew what he had, Ethan said quietly. A long silence on the other end. He knew, she said. Her voice was different now. Something had come loose in it, not dramatically, but in the small, cracking way of someone who has just understood something that changes the shape of what they thought they knew. He just didn't know how to prove it, Ethan said, and then he ran out of time. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He talked about it, she said finally. About that car. He said he'd bought it because it had a feeling. His exact word, feeling. I thought he was being sentimental. I thought... She stopped, started again. I told him once that he should just have it scrapped, that it was taking up space and it was never going to happen. Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't argue with me about it. He just said, some things are worth keeping even when you don't know why yet. The silence that followed that was the kind that didn't need filling. He was right, Ethan said eventually. Yes, she said, in a voice that was doing quiet work to stay level. He was. 12 days after the leak, Dr. Voss received the full commission file from the Stellarini archive. She called Ethan directly, which she hadn't done before. It had always been emails, formal and thorough. The fact that she called told him something. The commission file is complete, she said. Original intake documentation, workshop photographs, delivery records. The vehicle commissioned in 1968 under designation B-04 was delivered to a private buyer in January 1969. The buyer's name? The archive has it as a company name, Meridian Trading Group, registered in Luxembourg, which is consistent with how wealthy buyers of that era structured private purchases. Tracing it further is going to require separate research. But the vehicle is documented. Completely. A pause. Ethan, the workshop photographs. Yes? There's one taken during the body-forming process, the C-pillar, the same technique I identified in the car at the estate. Another pause. It's the same hands. The marks are identical. He sat down in his office chair, which creaked because it always creaked. Okay, he said. I want to be precise about what I can say formally at this stage, Dr. Voss said, in the voice of someone who needed to be precise and was being precise. But informally, I have been in this field for 31 years, and this is the moment where I would bet my career. That was Renata Voss. That was what that meant. I need to call Isabella Sterling, he said. Yes, and James. And we need to arrange the formal announcement. This needs to be done properly, in a controlled setting, with all the documentation present and the authentication team present. When? As soon as we can coordinate. The information is already circulating, and every day we wait, the narrative gets harder to control. She paused. And Ethan, you should be there, at the announcement. I'm not, he started. You identified this car. You initiated the process. Your role in this needs to be part of the record. Her voice was firm. This is not negotiable. He looked around his office, the desk covered in invoices, the cracked corner of the wall where Marcus had backed a truck too close once, the pine air freshener on its last legs. I'll be there, he said. He told Sophie that night. Not everything. She was 6, and the full complexity of international authentication and coach-building history and the economics of rare automobile discovery was several years beyond where she was. But he told her the broad shape of it, sitting on the edge of her bed while Gerald the elephant waited between them. The car might be very special, he said, really old and really rare. Experts are going to come and look at it and tell everyone what it is. Sophie thought about this. Did you figure it out? I thought I recognized it. Other people checked and they think I was right. How did you know? He considered this. Because I spent a long time learning about old cars. A really long time, with people who were very good at it. And even when I stopped doing that kind of work, the knowing didn't go away. She seemed to find this satisfying in some fundamental way. So you knew stuff even when nobody knew you knew it. Yeah, he said. Exactly like that. She nodded, tucking this information away with the efficiency of a 6-year-old who has gathered what she needed. Then, is the car going to be okay? The car is going to be looked after by people who know how to take care of it. Good, she said. It waited a long time. He kissed her forehead and turned off the light, and stood in the hallway after, in the dark, with the particular feeling of someone standing at the edge of something that was already, irreversibly, in motion. 3 days later, they set the date for the formal announcement. 2 weeks from Thursday. The authentication team, the estate, the documentation, all of it present, all of it in order. And on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days before that date, Isabella Sterling called him with something in her voice he hadn't heard before. Something unsettled, slightly urgent, underneath the control she usually maintained like a second skin. Mr. Walker, she said, there's something in the car. He straightened. What do you mean? George was doing a condition inventory of the interior, the dashboard housing. It's mostly stripped out, you know that. But behind what's left of the instrument cluster, there's something wedged back there. A pause. A notebook. He was very still. Has anyone touched it? George found it this morning and called me immediately. I told him not to touch anything. Good. Don't touch anything. He was already reaching for his jacket. I'll be there in an hour. Should we call Voss? Yes. Call her right now. And James. He was pulling out of the shop lot when his phone rang again. Isabella, calling back within 90 seconds. Voss says she can be there tomorrow morning, she said. James is driving up tonight. Okay? Ethan. Her use of his first name was so uncharacteristic that it pulled his attention completely. What do you think it is? He merged onto the highway, traffic heavier than he'd have liked, the city moving around him with its usual indifference. I don't know, he said honestly. But if your father spent 20 years keeping that car safe because he believed in what it was, he paused. It could be anything. A silence on the line. Drive carefully, she said, and hung up. He did, but he drove fast. But the notebook was small, smaller than he'd expected, bound in dark leather that had gone stiff and cracked with age, wedged behind the instrument cluster in a way that suggested it had been deliberately placed rather than accidentally left. It had survived the decades because the dashboard housing, though stripped, had still provided a kind of protection, keeping direct moisture off, maintaining the paper in a state of deterioration rather than destruction. George had found it with a flashlight while making measurements. It was slightly damp at the edges. The leather had fused in places. Ethan stood beside it without touching it, looking at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Isabella, who was standing on the other side of the car. Your father, he said carefully. Do you know his handwriting? Something moved across her face. Yes. When Voss gets here tomorrow, he said, when we open this under proper conditions, be prepared for it to be something personal. She looked at the notebook. You think it's his? I think he hid it there deliberately. I think he hid it in the car he loved without knowing exactly why he loved it. He paused. I think whatever's in there, he meant for it to be found eventually. She was quiet for a long time. The storage building was cold and very still, the work lights throwing their pale illumination across the old metal, across the rust that was no longer just rust but evidence, history, the physical record of something that had waited in the dark for decades for someone to know what they were looking at. Okay, Isabella Sterling said. Her voice was steady, but her hands, Ethan noticed, were not. Dr. Voss arrived at 7:53 in the morning, which was 7 minutes earlier than she'd said, which told Ethan something about how she'd slept. James Pruitt had driven up the night before and was already at the estate when Ethan pulled in at 7:30, standing near the storage building with a cup of coffee he'd apparently sourced from somewhere inside the main house, wearing the expression of a man who had been awake since 4 and had made peace with that. You see it? James asked. Last night, when Isabella called. Didn't touch it. Good. James looked at his coffee. I didn't sleep. I know. Did you sleep? Ethan had slept 4 hours, which was more than he'd expected. Some. James nodded like that was either impressive or concerning, and he hadn't decided which. Isabella Sterling came out of the house at 7:45. She was wearing dark clothes, no jewelry, and the kind of controlled composure that Ethan was beginning to recognize as her default setting under stress. Not coldness exactly, but a very deliberate arrangement of herself that kept the edges from showing. She'd been doing it since the first night on the terrace, and he understood it now in a way he hadn't initially. It wasn't arrogance, it was armor. She'd greeted James with a handshake and exchanged the kind of brief, efficient pleasantries that people exchanged when they both understood the pleasantries were a formality and the real conversation was elsewhere. Then she'd positioned herself slightly apart from both of them and waited. When Dr. Voss arrived, she came with a large case of equipment, conservation tools, lighting, a camera setup more professional than anything Ethan had brought previously, and a graduate student named Tobias, who was apparently trusted enough to be here and smart enough to stay quiet and do what he was told. Voss greeted everyone with brisk efficiency, assessed the storage building's conditions with a few minutes of quiet observation, and then asked that the space be cleared except for herself, Tobias, and Ethan. James didn't argue, which meant he understood. Isabella started to, then stopped, which meant she was learning. They waited outside in the November cold, James and Isabella, while the work happened inside. Ethan stayed near Tobias, watching. Voss worked with the specific patience of someone who knew that impatience cost more than time. It cost integrity. She photographed the notebook in place before anything was touched. She documented the exact position, the surrounding structure, the way it had been wedged against the instrument cluster housing. Then she removed it with gloved hands and placed it on a folding conservation table that Tobias had set up under the primary lights. The leather was dark brown, almost black with age and moisture. It was approximately 6 inches by 4, the kind of notebook you could put in a jacket pocket. A simple brass clasp on the side, tarnished to near black, held it shut. "The paper is going to be fragile," Voss said quietly, more to herself than to Ethan. "The moisture damage at the edges. Some pages may be fused. We need to go slowly." "Understood." She worked the clasp open with a conservation tool, gently without forcing it. The leather resisted briefly, then released. She opened the cover. The handwriting on the inside front page was in black ink, faded but legible. A name, and below it an address. An address in Connecticut that Ethan didn't recognize. Below the address, a date written in European format, the 14th of March, 1971. Ethan looked at Voss. She looked at him. 1971. The year the 1968 Stellarini Commission had disappeared from any documented record. Voss turned the page carefully. The second page held a sketch, rendered in pencil, detailed and confident, the hand of someone who understood what they were drawing. It showed the car, not as it existed now in its corroded state, but as it had been, or rather, as someone had envisioned it completed. The proportions were precise. The details of the bodywork, the wheels, the glass house, they mapped exactly to the vehicle sitting 6 feet from where they were standing. Below the sketch, a single line of handwriting. Stellarini B-04. The only one. Keep it safe. Voss set the page down and straightened up. She looked at Ethan for a long moment. "Get them," she said. Isabella came through the door of the storage building and stopped when she saw the notebook open on the conservation table. James came in behind her and positioned himself to the side, out of the way, reading the room correctly. "The name on the inside cover," Ethan said. "Do you recognize it?" She crossed to the table and looked. Her expression changed in a way that was impossible to misread. Not dramatically. Not the sharp intake of breath of a movie moment. Something quieter and more real. A kind of stillness that came over her face like a held breath. "That's my grandfather's name," she said. Nobody spoke for a moment. "Your father's father?" Ethan asked. "Yes." Her voice was careful, controlled, but working harder than usual. "He died before I was born. My father didn't talk about him much. Their relationship was complicated." She paused. "He was a collector, mostly European art and antiques. My father inherited some of it when he died, sold most of it." Another pause. "He kept some things." "This car," James said quietly. Isabella looked at the sketch on the second page, the careful drawing of the car, the proportions exact, the handwriting below it. The only one. Keep it safe. "He knew what it was," she said. "He knew exactly what it was," Ethan said. "He had it in 1971, and he documented it." "But my father—" She stopped. "My father bought it at auction. At least that's what George told me. He went to Europe. He bought things at estate sales and auctions." "Your grandfather died in what year?" Ethan asked. She thought. 1992, I think. I wasn't born yet, but I think my mother mentioned, if the car was in your grandfather's possession from 1971, and your father was going to estate sales in Europe in the early 2000s. Ethan left the sentence unfinished. Isabella looked at the notebook again, at her grandfather's name in faded ink. "He bought his own family's car back," she said slowly. "Without knowing that's what he was doing." The room was very quiet. "Or knowing partially," Ethan said. "Your father had that print in his office, the Stellarini drawing with the B04 designation. He might have known there was a connection without knowing what it was." "He said it had a feeling," Isabella said, almost to herself. "He used that word." James cleared his throat softly. "There are more pages," he said. Voss spent the next 2 hours carefully working through the notebook, photographing each page before and after turning it, occasionally pausing when a page had moisture damage and required extra care. Tobias documented everything on video. Ethan stood near the door and watched Isabella watch the process. The notebook was not entirely about the car. That was the thing none of them had expected. The first section, about 15 pages, was documentation. Sketches of the car from multiple angles, technical notes about its specifications, references to the original workshop order and the delivery in Monaco in 1969. Her grandfather had been meticulous. He'd known what he had, and he'd kept records of it in a form that would survive if the formal paper trail didn't. But after the documentation, the notebook changed. The handwriting shifted. Not a different hand, but the same hand in a different register. Less precise. More human. The entries were dated and occasional, spanning from 1971 to what appeared to be the mid-1980s. They were personal. Observations. Memories. The record of a man thinking things through on paper. Voss read them quietly as she went, not aloud, her expression careful. At one point she stopped on a page and looked up at Ethan with something in her face that was hard to name. "Some of these entries," she said, "are about the car specifically. Why he bought it. Why he kept it." She paused. "He talks about the maker, about what it meant that something this beautiful had been lost, and what it would mean to bring it back." Isabella was very still across the room. "And some of them," Voss continued, "are about a son." Nobody said anything. "He writes about teaching his son about old things, about the value of things that lasted." She paused. "The son isn't named, but the entries about him, they're different from the rest, less controlled." Isabella's jaw moved slightly. "He was trying to pass something down," Ethan said. "Yes," Voss said. "And it didn't work, or it didn't work the way he intended." "It worked eventually," James said quietly from his corner. "Just slower than he planned." Isabella turned away from the room and walked toward the car. She put her hand on the roof panel, on the rust, and stood there with her back to all of them. Nobody rushed her. After a while she said, "Can we take a break?" It wasn't a question. "Of course," Voss said. "Mutt." The break was 20 minutes. Ethan spent it outside in the cold, leaning against his truck, checking his phone out of habit and finding nothing that needed immediate attention. Marcus had texted that the Matos Silverado was finally done, and the owner had picked it up without complaint, which was the best possible outcome for a brake job that had been more expensive than anyone wanted. Sophie's school had sent an automated reminder about a parent meeting next week that Ethan had already forgotten about and now re-forgot. He put his phone away and looked at the outbuilding. The thing about objects, he thought, old objects, objects that had lasted, was that they accumulated meaning the way metal accumulated stress. You couldn't always see it. It didn't always show on the surface. But it was structural. It was in the material itself, in what the material had been through, and when you understood what you were looking at, you could read it. The car in that building had been through a chain of human hands and human decisions spanning more than 50 years. It had been commissioned by someone who wanted beauty and rarity. It had been bought and kept by a man who understood what it was and tried to pass that understanding forward. It had crossed an ocean in a way nobody had fully documented, had sat in the dark for 2 decades in conditions that should have been better, had been treated like junk by a daughter who hadn't known, and had been recognized by a mechanic at a charity event who'd been walking through the wrong gap between 2 buildings at the right moment. If you wrote it as a story, Ethan thought, it would seem contrived, too many coincidences, too neat. But that was the thing about real life. The coincidences were there. They were just usually quieter about it. The door of the building opened and Isabella came out. She walked to where he was standing and stopped a few feet away, looking at nothing in particular. "I owe you an apology," she said. He looked at her. "The first night, on the terrace, when you came to talk to me about the car." She paused. "I was dismissive." "You were skeptical," he said. "That's not the same thing. I told you my lawyers could determine that your name was legitimate, like I was checking if you were allowed to be talking to me. You were being careful." "I was being condescending," she said flatly. "And I knew it at the time, and I did it anyway." She paused. "I have a habit of that, deciding what people are before I've finished looking at them." He didn't argue with her, because she was right, and they both knew it, and he wasn't in the habit of softening things to make them easier to hear. "You adjusted," he said instead. She looked at him. "That's a very generous way to put it." It's the accurate way. She was quiet for a moment. My father would have liked you, she said. He valued people who knew things deeply, who carried expertise quietly. A pause. He would have recognized you. I'm glad he kept the car, Ethan said. Yes. She looked back at the building. So am I. They went back inside. The formal announcement was 4 days later. The venue was the estate's main reception room, which Isabella had cleared of its usual furniture and arranged with a long table, proper lighting, and enough space for the authentication team and approximately 20 invited guests, representatives from major automotive institutions, 2 editors from specialist publications, a curator from a national automotive museum who had flown in from Detroit, and the legal representatives who had been involved in documenting the authentication process. No press. Isabella had been firm about that, and Patricia Crane, the cultural property attorney, had supported the decision. The controlled announcement would go out through proper channels afterward. What happened in this room today was for the record, not for the headlines. Ethan arrived at 9 in the morning and helped Voss and Tobias set up the presentation materials. The photographic documentation, the dimensional analysis data, the commission file from the Stellarini archive, the paint analysis results that had come back from Stuttgart 6 days earlier, confirming period-appropriate composition, the notebook and its contents. The guests arrived between 9:30 and 10. Ethan stayed near the back of the room. He wasn't presenting anything. That was Voss's role, and James's, and he was comfortable with that. He'd been the one to find it. What came after was other people's work. But he watched the room carefully as it filled, because the people coming through the door were people who understood what this was, and watching the faces of experts confronted with something genuinely rare was its own specific thing. The curator from Detroit, a woman named Dr. Harriet Okafor, had spent 40 years in automotive history and walked into the room with the focused skepticism of someone who had been disappointed before. She looked at the photographic documentation for 3 minutes without speaking, then turned to find Ethan standing behind her. You identified this, she said, not accusatory, more like calibrating. Initial identification, yes. Based on what specifically? He told her. The bodywork geometry, the hand-formed aluminum, the specific proportions. She listened with her arms crossed and her eyes slightly narrowed. The expression of someone running an internal verification process. The C-pillar, she said. Yes. And you caught that in about 15 minutes, under poor lighting conditions. She looked at him for a moment. Who are you? Ethan Walker. I run a repair shop on Clement Street. She blinked. A repair shop. Yes. You identified a lost Stellarini commission in 15 minutes while working a catering event. Vehicle support, he said. Not catering. She stared at him for another second, then turned back to the photographs without another word. But something had shifted in her expression. The skepticism was still there, but underneath it something else had opened up, a kind of alert attention that was different from what she'd walked in with. James found Ethan 15 minutes later. Voss is ready. You should be up front. I'm fine back here. Ethan? James? You're not doing the humble mechanic thing right now. Get up front. Ethan looked at him. I'm not doing anything. I just don't need to be. The people in this room are about to hear about one of the most significant automotive discoveries in decades. The person who made that discovery should be visible. James paused. Not for ego, for record, for what this means professionally. To you, for what you built before, for what this confirms about your expertise. Ethan was quiet. 6 years, James said more quietly. You spent 6 years on Clement Street being very good at something smaller than what you're actually capable of. Today matters. I didn't do it for... I know why you did it. I know it wasn't for recognition. That doesn't mean the recognition isn't warranted. James paused. Come up front. He went. But Dr. Voss presented for 40 minutes. She was methodical and unshowy, which was exactly right, which was why she was the right person to be standing at the front of the room. She took the gathered evidence piece by piece, laid it out in order, addressed the corroborating elements, acknowledged the areas where further research was ongoing, and arrived at her formal conclusion with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done the work and knew what it said. The 1968 Stellerini Carrozzeria Commission, designation B-04, previously considered lost, had been located, authenticated through multiple independent lines of evidence, and confirmed as a surviving example of the coach builder's work from that period. The room was quiet when she finished. Then Dr. Okafor, from her seat near the front, said, "Estimated value?" Voss looked at James, who had done the market analysis in consultation with 2 auction specialists. "Conservative estimate based on current market comparables for authenticated Stellerini work, rarity classification, and condition, between $8 and $12 million, James said, with restoration to appropriate standard, potentially higher. The room stayed quiet for a moment, then several conversations started at once, the contained buzz of experts processing something significant and beginning to think about what it meant for their respective institutions and interests. At the back of the room, near the door, Isabella Sterling was standing with her arms at her sides, which was different from her usual crossed posture, and Ethan noticed it because he'd been paying attention to the way she held herself for weeks. She was listening to the number, to what it meant, to what her father had kept in a storage building for 20 years. After a moment, James said, "To the room, not just to Voss, the initial identification of this vehicle was made by Mr. Ethan Walker, who was present at this estate approximately 7 weeks ago in an unrelated capacity. His recognition of the vehicle's potential significance, under poor conditions and in under 15 minutes, initiated the authentication process that led to today's announcement. In the assessment of this team, the identification demonstrates expertise at a level possessed by very few people working in this field." Ethan felt the attention of the room shift toward him. He didn't move, didn't change his expression, stood where he was near the front and let the attention happen. Dr. Okafor turned to look at him again. Several others did the same. One of the editors, a man named Garrett, who wrote for an automotive history publication that Ethan had been reading since he was 22, was already making a note. "Mr. Walker," Voss said from the front of the room, "is there anything you'd like to add?" He thought about it. "No," he said, and then, because that was too short for the room and for what the room deserved, "The car did most of the work. It kept the evidence. It held together long enough for someone to look at it." He paused. "That's what these objects do when they're significant enough. They wait." Garrett, the editor, wrote something else down. The formal gathering broke up over the next hour into smaller conversations, the kind of organized chaos of experts who suddenly have many things to discuss with each other. Ethan moved through it the same way he'd moved through the evening itself, present, engaged when engaged directly, not pushing. Dr. Okafor found him near the documentation table. "Walker Automotive Repair," she said. "Clement Street." "That's right." "You've been there 6 years." "Yes." "And before that?" He gave her the short version. The restoration business, the circumstances of closing it. She listened without filling the silences. "Would you be interested in a consultancy relationship with the museum?" she said. He looked at her. "Not full-time," she said quickly. "Not relocating. We consult with independent specialists regularly. Identification work, authentication support, condition assessment on potential acquisitions." She paused. "The kind of work that requires the particular expertise you apparently have." He was quiet for a moment. "Let me think about it," he said. "Of course." She handed him a card. "Take your time." He pocketed it and she moved away, and he stood there for a moment with the noise of the room around him, the conversations and the quiet excitement, and the particular atmosphere of people who cared deeply about something being gathered in a space where something they cared about had just been confirmed to matter. He thought about Clement Street, the green sign, the pine air freshener, the creak of his office chair. He thought about Sophie. He thought about the right answer to Dr. Okafor's question, which he didn't have yet, but which felt like it was becoming clearer. Isabella Sterling appeared at his elbow. "Can I talk to you?" she said. "Sure." She guided him slightly away from the nearest cluster of people into a section of the room that was momentarily clear. "The notebook," she said. I've been thinking about it. Okay. The entries about the son, my father. She paused. Voss mentioned that your team will need to retain the notebook as part of the authenticated record for documentation. Temporarily, it'll be returned to you. It's yours. I know. She was quiet for a moment. There are things in there, the personal entries, that I'm not ready for other people to read. I understand it's part of the record. I understand why it has to be documented. Another pause. I just want you to know that I understand what it is. It's not just provenance documentation. It's letters he never sent, Ethan said. She looked at him. To your father, he said. That's what they read like. Things he wanted to communicate that didn't find another way out. She was quiet for a moment that was longer than the ones before. My father kept the car, she said, for 20 years without fully understanding why. Yes. And my grandfather wrote things down in that notebook and hid them in the car, which meant eventually, she stopped. If the car was ever properly found, the notebook would be found with it, Ethan said, and eventually someone would read it. He hid a message in the thing he loved most, she said. It was barely above a statement, but she was working something through. And my father spent 20 years keeping it safe without knowing that was what he was doing. Ethan didn't say anything. They were terrible at talking to each other, she said. My father told me that much. He said his relationship with his father was, she paused, unfinished. That was his word, unfinished. And now there's a notebook, Ethan said. And now there's a notebook. She looked down at the floor for a moment, then back up. Is that? She stopped, started again with a different approach. How do you hold something like that? Finding out that someone... I don't know, Ethan said honestly. I don't think there's a clean way to do it. You just hold it. She looked at him. The unfinished things don't usually finish, he said. They just become something you can see more clearly. What was there? What was missed? What the intention was underneath the mess of it. He paused. That's not nothing. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It's not nothing. Across the room, someone called her name. One of the estate representatives needing to coordinate something logistical. She excused herself with a brief nod and moved away, and Ethan watched her go and thought about fathers and the complicated ways love moved through families and the objects that got left behind and what those objects held. He thought about the print in Richard Sterling's office, the Stellarini sketch with the B04 designation, which had been on the wall for as long as Isabella could remember. The thing her father had looked at every day without fully knowing what he was looking at, keeping something safe without knowing why yet. That line had lodged in him when he'd first heard it, and it hadn't moved. The room was thinning out by noon. People were finishing conversations, exchanging cards, making plans for follow-up calls and formal correspondence. The authentication team was beginning the careful process of packing the documentation. James was talking to one of the editors in a corner. Ethan went outside. He stood near his truck in the cold, in the same spot where Isabella had come to him weeks ago and told him about the notebook with something urgent underneath her voice. The grounds were quiet, the late November light pale and thin, the sound of the city barely audible beyond the estate's perimeter. His phone buzzed. Sophie's school, the parent meeting reminder again. He read it this time. Next Thursday at 6. He typed a confirmation into the response form while standing in the cold outside a building where people were discussing a $9 million discovery, and the particular absurdity of that was not lost on him. James came out 10 minutes later. Okafor offered you something, he said. It wasn't a question. Consultancy. What did you say? That I'd think about it. James nodded. It's a good offer. I know. It doesn't have to be either/or, James said. The shop, the consultancy work. These things aren't mutually exclusive. I know that too. But, James read him. Ethan looked at the outbuilding. But I need to make sure I'm saying yes for the right reasons. Not because today felt a certain way, not because a room full of people recognize something, but because you want to do the work, James said. Yeah. Do you? He thought about the 15 minutes under poor lighting when something had stopped his feet. The 3 weeks of late nights and careful documentation and holding a fragile theory gently enough not to break it before it could be confirmed. The call with Carl Bauer at 3 in the morning. The way the hammer marks had looked in the aluminum under Voss's flashlight. The car waiting in the dark, keeping it secret, patient in the specific way that only objects could be patient. "Yeah," he said, "I do." James clapped him once on the shoulder, which was as demonstrative as James got, and went back inside. Ethan stood there for another minute. Then he pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Delgado to confirm pickup time for Sophie. "You okay?" Mrs. Delgado asked. "Yeah," he said. "Long day." "Good long or bad long?" He looked at the pale November sky, the thin light, the quiet grounds of an estate that had been keeping a secret it didn't know it was keeping. "Good," he said. "Definitely good." He got in his truck. He had a parent meeting to put in his calendar, and a Subaru that Marcus had left half-finished, and a coffee maker at home that was still doing its 40% thing, and a 6-year-old who would want to know everything that happened today in terms she could actually use. The most significant automotive discovery in 2 decades. He was pretty sure Sophie was going to want to know if the car was happy. He drove home to figure out how to answer that. The article came out on a Thursday. Ethan found out about it the way he found out about most things he hadn't been expecting. Through Marcus, who came into the shop at 8:05 waving his phone like he'd won something. "You're in Automotive Heritage Quarterly," Marcus said, "like the actual print edition. Online right now, print next month." Ethan was under a Dodge Ram at the time, dealing with an exhaust issue that was both simpler and messier than the owner had described. He slid out on the creeper, sat up, and took Marcus's phone. The piece was written by Garrett, the editor who'd been taking notes at the announcement. It was 4,000 words, which for a specialist publication was substantial, and it covered the authentication in detail. The commission file from the Stellarini archive, the dimensional analysis, the paint composition results, the notebook. It was careful and accurate, and read like someone who understood both the technical significance and the human dimensions of what had happened. The section about Ethan was 3 paragraphs near the end. He read it twice. It described his professional background, the restoration business, the reputation he'd built in that earlier career, the names of some of the authentication cases he'd been part of before he closed the business. Then it described the identification, how he'd seen the car under poor lighting at a catering event in less than 15 minutes, and recognized what nobody else present had recognized, and initiated the process that led to a confirmed discovery valued at between $8 and $12 million. The last line of his section read, "Walker currently operates a small repair shop on Clement Street. He is 32 years old." Marcus was watching him with barely contained excitement. 3 paragraphs, Ethan said. 3 paragraphs in AHQ, Marcus said. "Do you know what that is? In the restoration world? That's like..." "I know what it is. People are going to call. People are already calling." This was true. Since the controlled announcement had gone out through proper channels 4 days ago. His email had received 27 messages from people he didn't know and 6 from people he did. His phone had 2 voicemails he hadn't listened to yet. "That doesn't change what we have to do today." Marcus looked at the Dodge Ram. He looked at Ethan. He looked back at the phone. "One of us is more excited about this than the other," he said. "I noticed. That should probably concern you." "Get the torque wrench," Ethan said, and slid back under the truck. The calls fell into predictable categories. There were the people from the automotive world, restoration specialists, collectors, dealers, who were reaching out to reestablish or establish connections now that Ethan Walker had become a name that was attached to something significant. Some of them he'd known before, in his previous career, and hadn't heard from in years. The reappearance of those particular voices was something he noticed without quite knowing what to do with it. There were the institutional inquiries. Dr. Okafor's formal letter arrived from the Detroit Museum 2 days after the article, reiterating the consultancy offer in professional language with specific terms attached. A similar inquiry came from a foundation in Chicago that focused on mid-century European design. A restoration workshop in California that he'd admired from a distance for a decade sent a brief direct email from its director asking if he'd be open to a conversation. And then there were the others, the ones that didn't fit a category, The ones that arrived carrying more weight than they appeared to. A handwritten letter, actual paper in an envelope with a stamp from Karl Bauer in Stuttgart. Ethan opened it at his kitchen table on a Friday night while Sophie was watching her show in the other room. Karl's handwriting had always been precise, an architect's hand, trained and deliberate, but now it moved across the page with the slight unevenness of a man whose eyesight was giving him ongoing trouble. "I told you once," Karl had written, "that the most important thing about this work is not the finding. Anyone with enough luck and the right moment can stumble onto something significant. The important thing is the knowing. What you carry with you that allows you to recognize what you're seeing when you see it. That is earned. That cannot be stumbled onto. You carried it for 6 years in a repair shop, and it was exactly as present as it was the day you left. That is what today means. Don't let anyone, including yourself, reduce it to a story about luck." Ethan read the letter twice, then folded it and put it on the kitchen counter where he wouldn't lose it. Sophie came in for a glass of water and saw his face. "What's that?" she asked. "A letter from an old teacher." She looked at the envelope with the foreign stamp. "He lives far away?" "Germany." "Did he say something nice?" Ethan looked at the folded letter. "Yeah, he said something nice." She considered this with the gravity of someone who understood that nice things in letters mattered. "Good," she said, and took her water back to her show. The harder call came from a direction he hadn't anticipated. His ex-wife Lauren called on a Saturday morning. They were not close, hadn't been for years. Communicated mostly through text about Sophie's schedule and the rare logistical situation that required actual conversation. The call itself was enough of an anomaly that he almost didn't pick up, wondering if something was wrong. "I saw the article," she said when he answered. He adjusted his grip on the phone. "Okay. The one in the automotive magazine. Someone sent it to me." "Okay." A pause. "That's a big deal," she said. "What you found?" "The authentication team found it. I identified it." "Ethan." Her voice was doing something he couldn't read cleanly. "That's a big deal." He didn't say anything. "I wanted to... I don't know. I'm not sure why I called exactly." Another pause, and he could hear her working through something. "I know it was a sacrifice. When you closed the business, I know you've never said it was my fault, but I know the math of it." "Lauren?" "I'm not calling to have a whole thing," she said quickly. "I just wanted to say that seeing this, knowing that you still have it, that you never actually lost it, that matters to me. For Sophie, for what she gets to see." A pause. "She's going to know what her father did." He was quiet for a moment. "She already knows," he said. "She asked me if the car was happy." A short, surprised sound from Lauren that was almost a laugh. "Of course she did." "I told her I thought it was relieved." An actual laugh this time. Brief. Then, "I'm glad, Ethan. I mean that." "I know," he said. And he did. After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a while with his coffee, thinking about the math of things. The way decisions accumulated into circumstances that you couldn't entirely separate from the person you'd become inside them. He didn't blame Lauren for the closing of the business. He didn't blame himself for it either, most days. What he'd built on Clement Street was real work, and he'd done it well. And if there was loss in it, there was also, he could see this more clearly now than he had before, a kind of integrity. He'd done what needed doing. He'd kept his kids safe and his shop running, and he'd gotten good at a different kind of work without stopping being good at the first kind. Karl was right. The knowing had stayed. He just hadn't needed to use it for a long time. The situation with Isabella Sterling got complicated around day 12 after the announcement, and it got complicated in a way Ethan should probably have anticipated but hadn't fully. The Sterling Foundation's board had opinions. This was not surprising. Foundation boards always had opinions. That was the entire organizational purpose of a foundation board. But the specific opinion they were developing about the car was one that Patricia Crane, the cultural property attorney, called Ethan about on a Tuesday afternoon with a tone in her voice that indicated she found the situation mildly absurd. "The board wants to sell," Patricia said. "Immediately. They've already had 2 approaches from private collectors and 1 from a European institution, and the numbers are significant enough that several board members are treating this as an obvious financial decision for the foundation. It's Isabella's decision, Ethan said. The estate is hers. The foundation has a governance structure that gives the board input on major asset decisions. It's complicated. A pause. And Isabella has her own position, which is she hasn't decided yet. She's resistant to the immediate sale, but doesn't have a clear alternative articulated. What does she want to do with it? That's what she hasn't quite figured out, which is human and understandable and also creating a vacuum that the board members with strong opinions are filling. Another pause. I'm telling you because she values your perspective on this. She hasn't said so directly, but she's referenced your judgment twice in conversations where she didn't need to. Ethan looked out the shop window at Clement Street. A woman was pushing a stroller past the dry cleaner. A delivery truck was double parked outside the print shop that was still closed. What did you advise her? He asked. I advised her to take 30 days before making any decision. The car isn't going anywhere and the market isn't going anywhere. Rushing a decision about something this significant, financially and personally, is rarely wise. That's good advice. I know it's good advice. I'd like her to hear it from someone she trusts as well. He understood the implication. I'm not sure she trusts me specifically. You identified the car. You managed the authentication process without any formal arrangement or compensation. You told her things about her father's relationship to the car that she didn't have language for yet. Patricia paused. She trusts you, Mr. Walker. She's just not comfortable with what that means. He thought about Isabella on the terrace of the estate, her arms uncrossed for the first time, her voice doing that cracking thing when she talked about her grandfather's notebook. The way she'd used his first name when she called him about the notebook being found. A single deviation from her usual register that she probably didn't even realize she'd made. I'll call her, he said. Thank you. He called her that evening after Sophie was in bed. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd been expecting it. Patricia talked to you, she said. Yes. I figured she would. A pause. She's right that I'm not decided. What are you leaning toward? A long silence. I'm leaning toward not selling, at least not the way the board is describing, not as a pure financial transaction to whoever writes the largest check. Another pause. The car has context now. The notebook. What we know about my grandfather. What we know about my father keeping it without fully understanding why. She stopped. It feels wrong to just put it in a billionaire's private garage and close the chapter. What would feel right? She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about an institutional arrangement, a long-term loan to a museum, the right museum, with restoration to appropriate standard included as a condition. The car would be restored, displayed, accessible. The provenance story would be part of the display. Including the notebook? Including the notebook, or at least the documentation story, the personal entries. I'd want some say in what's shared. A pause. Does that seem like a reasonable position to you? He thought about it honestly. It's a significant financial sacrifice relative to an outright sale. I know. The foundation board is going to push back. I know that too. But it's the right call for the car, he said. If the goal is for the car to be seen and understood and properly preserved, a private sale doesn't guarantee any of that. An institutional arrangement does. The foundation has resources, she said. The board wants to maximize them. I understand that perspective. She stopped. My father didn't keep that car for 20 years so it could disappear into someone's climate-controlled private collection. No, Ethan said. He didn't. She was quiet. Dr. Okafor's museum, he said. In Detroit. She's been careful not to be aggressive about pursuing the car. She knows how this needs to be handled. But her institution would be a serious option to consider. They have the restoration capacity, the expertise to display it correctly, the credibility. You'd vouch for her? I'd vouch for the institution. Okafor. I've only met once, but she's exactly who she appears to be, which in my experience is rarer than it should be. Isabella made a sound that was somewhere between acknowledgement and something wry. Rare qualities. Yeah. Another silence. Then, what would you do if it were yours? He didn't answer immediately. He let the question sit. I'd send it somewhere that would treat it like what it is, he said finally. Not a trophy, not an investment, an object with a specific story that deserves to be told properly. He paused. And I'd make sure the notebook was part of the record. Not hidden, not sensationalized, part of the record. Because of what it says about my grandfather. Because of what it says about why people keep things, he said. About what we're trying to pass forward when we hold on to something longer than makes practical sense. The line was quiet for a moment. My father was like that, she said. He kept things, books, objects, that crate of botanical drawings. He held on to things because he believed they mattered even when he couldn't articulate why. Another pause. I used to find it excessive. I used to think that it was a kind of avoidance, caring about objects instead of... She stopped. Instead of what? Instead of being present, she said quietly. For me. For us. A long pause. We weren't close. He was a difficult man to be close to, and I spent a long time thinking the objects were a substitute for something he didn't know how to give. Ethan was quiet. He didn't offer an alternative reading, didn't rush to tell her she was wrong. But the notebook, she said, the entries about my father, my grandfather trying to communicate something he didn't have language for, hiding it in the thing he loved most. She paused. Maybe the objects weren't a substitute. Maybe they were the language, the only one some people have. He thought about the print on Richard Sterling's office wall, the B04 designation, the car parked in a storage building for 20 years kept safe without full understanding. Maybe, he said. It doesn't fix anything, she said. It doesn't make the distance smaller. It doesn't it doesn't change what it was. No. But it's something. Yeah, he said. It's something. The board meeting was 3 weeks later, and Ethan wasn't there for it because it was a Sterling Foundation internal matter that had nothing to do with him, and he'd never pretended otherwise. But Patricia Crane texted him at 4 p.m. on the day of the meeting. She held her ground, long-term institutional loan. Detroit got it pending formal negotiation. Board was unhappy. She didn't move. He read the text standing in the shop, between the end of a brake job and the start of an oil change, and he felt something settle in him that he hadn't realized was still unsettled. Marcus looked at him from across the shop. Good news? Yeah? Car stuff? Yeah. Marcus nodded with the patient acceptance of someone who'd been working adjacent to this story for weeks without getting the full version. Cool, he said, and went back to what he was doing. Ethan pocketed his phone and moved to the next vehicle. Isabella called him the following week. He was in the shop parking lot eating lunch, same place, same too much butter sandwich, when his phone buzzed with her name. He answered with a mouth partially full, which was not ideal. And she either didn't notice or was too focused on what she was calling about to care. I want to ask you something, she said. Okay? The restoration. Detroit has agreed in principle to the institutional arrangement, but the restoration itself, she paused. The car needs to be brought back properly, in a way that respects what it is without erasing what it's been through. The rust, the history of it. Another pause. They have a restoration team, but I've been thinking, Isabella, he knew where this was going. You don't have to, she said quickly. You have the shop. You have your other obligations. I know I don't have to. And I know you've been approached about other things. I know. So if this isn't Isabella, he stopped her. Are you asking me to lead the restoration? A pause. I'm asking if you'd consider it, in a consultancy capacity. With the Detroit team doing the primary work, you'd be overseeing, advising, making the calls that require the specific expertise. Another pause. Paid. Properly. Patricia has a structure for it. He looked at his sandwich. He thought about the B04 in the storage building, the hand-formed aluminum under the rust, the hammer marks in the panel that were the fingerprint of someone who had spent their life learning how to shape metal and had done it one last time on this particular car. He thought about what it would mean to bring that back, To sit with the process of returning something to what it had been, or close enough that the intention of it was legible again, that you could look at it and understand what the person who made it was trying to say. He thought about Sophie's question, "Can you fix it?" And his answer, "That's not really my job on this one." He'd been wrong about that. "Yes," he said, "I'll do it." A brief silence. Then, in a voice that had something relieved in it that she wasn't quite disguising, "Good. Send me Patricia's structure. I'll have my own attorney look at it." "Of course." A pause. "Ethan." Again his first name, this time clearly deliberate. "Thank you, not just for this, for all of it, the way you handled everything from the beginning." He finished the last bite of his sandwich. "The car did most of the work." "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true." A short pause, and then something that was almost a laugh. "I'll have Patricia send the documents today." "Won't." He told Marcus that afternoon. The full version, which took about 20 minutes, and which Marcus received with the exact expression of someone watching a puzzle resolve in real time. When Ethan finished, Marcus was quiet for a second. Then, "So you're going to restore a $9 million car? In a consultancy capacity? While still running the shop?" "That's the plan." Marcus looked around the shop. The 2 lifts, the parts wall, the invoice-covered desk. "Are we going to be okay? Here?" The question was practical and genuine, and Ethan appreciated it for that. "The consultancy work is time-bounded," he said. "The restoration will take 18 months to 2 years. The on-site work at Detroit is periodic, a few days a month, with ongoing remote consultation in between. The shop stays open. We might need to bring someone else in part-time." Marcus nodded slowly. "So you're not—" He paused. "You're not leaving?" "No." "I mean, you could," Marcus said. "After this. You could go back to doing this full-time, the restoration world. People are calling you." "I know." "Why aren't you?" Ethan looked at the shop. The green sign visible through the window, the chip in the paint, the coffee maker on the parts shelf that worked better than the one at home. "Because this is also what I do," he said. "It was never less than that." Marcus thought about this for a moment. "That's either very wise or very stubborn," he said. "Probably both," Ethan said. He went to the estate one more time before the logistics of the Detroit transfer began. It was a December afternoon, cold and overcast, the kind of light that made everything look like the last day of something. He had no official reason to be there. The authentication was complete. The arrangement was in place. His formal involvement with the estate had concluded. But Isabella had said she was spending the afternoon there handling some final documentation, and when he called to ask if he could come by, she said yes without asking why. He stood in the storage building alone for about 15 minutes. The car was unchanged, of course. It had been wrapped and stabilized for the transfer, which was happening in 2 weeks. The condition was documented. The security arrangements were in place. Everything was as it should be for the next step. But he wanted to be there one more time in the quiet of it. He thought about the first night, the pale work light, his feet stopping, the shape of the car against the illumination, the 15 minutes that had started everything, the casual cruelty of an accumulation of coincidences that had placed him in exactly that gap between buildings at exactly that moment. He thought about Carl's letter. The important thing is the knowing. He thought about Sophie. Did the old car know someone had finally come back for it? He put his hand on the roof panel, the same place Isabella had stood with her palm flat against the rust. The metal was cold. The surface was rough under his fingers. He didn't say anything. He wasn't the kind of person who talked to cars, as a rule. He just stayed for a minute, his hand on the metal, in the cold and the quiet, with the particular feeling of someone who has done what they came to do and is taking a moment to notice it before moving on to the next thing. Isabella found him there when she came in from the main house. She stopped in the doorway for a second, reading the scene, and then came in without announcing herself and stood on the other side of the car. "Patricia got your attorney's notes," she said. "Everything looks straightforward." "Good." "The Detroit team is planning an initial call next week. I've asked them to include you." "I saw the calendar invite." They were quiet for a moment. the two of them on opposite sides of the wrapped car in the cold building. I read the rest of the notebook, she said. He didn't ask what she meant by the rest. She'd read it in stages, which made sense, which was the only way some things could be read. Are you okay? He asked. She considered this with more honesty than he expected. Not entirely, but better than I was. A pause. There's an entry near the end. My grandfather writing about what he hoped for. Not for the car specifically, for what he was trying to give forward. She paused. He writes about a child he hoped would receive it. He didn't know who. He just hoped it would find the right person eventually. Ethan was quiet. He didn't know my father well enough to know if my father was that person, she said. She paused. They were complicated with each other, the same way my father and I were complicated. A pause. But he hoped. And your father kept the car, Ethan said. My father kept the car. She was quiet for a moment. Maybe that was his answer, even if he didn't know the question. The building was very still. The child your grandfather hoped for, Ethan said carefully. It might have been you. She looked at him across the wrapped roof of the car. My grandfather never knew me, she said. No, but your father kept the car until a moment when someone who knew what it was walked through the right gap at the right time. And now you're the one deciding what happens to it next. And the decision you made... He paused. The institutional loan, the restoration, the provenance story as part of the display. She was very still. Your grandfather wrote that he wanted it to be seen, Ethan said. He wanted it to be understood. That's what you've arranged. The silence that followed was the long, particular kind. Then Isabella Sterling looked at the car, the shape of it under the protective wrapping, the suggestion of the bodywork beneath. And she let out a breath that seemed to carry something with it, not dramatically, just quietly, in the specific way of someone releasing a thing they've been holding for longer than they realized. Okay, she said. Just that. But the way she said it landed differently than the same word had when she'd said it in the same building weeks ago. This one had something settled in it, something that wasn't resignation or acceptance so much as a kind of arrival. He understood it because he'd felt something similar himself, standing in his kitchen after that first late night of research, after the hammer marks under Voss's flashlight, after James said, "Come up front," and he'd gone. The moment when something you'd been uncertain about resolves. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but resolves. "I'll see you on the Detroit call," he said. "Yes," she said. He drove home in the December dark, the city doing its evening thing around him, lights coming on, traffic thickening and thinning in its usual rhythms, the particular smell of cold air coming through the truck's vents. He stopped at a red light on Clement Street, 2 blocks from the shop, and sat there for a moment while the light cycled. He thought about the parent meeting he'd attended last Thursday. He'd sat in a small chair across from Sophie's teacher, who was 26 and earnest and had said Sophie was doing well, but could sometimes be reluctant to share things with the group. She keeps her ideas to herself until she's sure about them, the teacher had said. Ethan had nodded, looking at the small chair, thinking about a 6-year-old who checked under the couch twice before giving up, who didn't tell you about the stomachache unless she was sure it was going to matter, who asked whether the old car knew someone had come back for it because she wanted to understand the emotional logic of things before she accepted them. She gets that from her father, he'd said. The teacher had smiled. It'll serve her well eventually. Yeah, he'd said. It took me a while, but it did. The light turned green. He drove home. The Detroit call happened on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December at 7:30 because the museum's chief conservator was based in London and the time difference made everyone's schedule slightly miserable. Ethan took the call from his kitchen, coffee in hand, Sophie still asleep down the hall. He'd propped his laptop on the counter and stood for most of it because sitting felt wrong for the kind of conversation it turned out to be. The Detroit team was thorough and serious and asked the right questions, which meant they were also asking difficult ones, the kind that required him to think carefully before answering rather than just retrieving a prepared response. The chief conservator was a man named David Osei, London-based, calm in the particular way of someone who had spent 20 years in a field that punished impatience. He and Ethan talked for 40 minutes about the restoration approach before anyone else on the call said much. The core question was the one Ethan had been thinking about since Isabella first raised the possibility of an institutional arrangement. How much do you restore? It was not a simple question. It had philosophical dimensions that the automotive and conservation worlds had been arguing about for decades, and there was no consensus answer. On one end of the spectrum, full restoration, returning the vehicle as close as possible to its original specification, filling gaps in the historical record with best available scholarship, making it look and function as the coach builder intended. On the other end, conservation, stabilizing what existed, halting further deterioration, preserving the object as it was found rather than as it once was. The B-04 had been sitting in improper storage for approximately 30 years. The rust was severe. The interior had been stripped at some unknown point. Body damage in the front suggested an impact of unknown origin and date. What remained was structurally compromised in places but materially present. The aluminum panels, though corroded, were largely intact beneath the surface damage. The fundamental object was there. My position, Ethan said, is that the approach has to honor both what it was and what it's been through. You don't scrub the history off it in order to make it look factory new. You bring it back to structural integrity and material clarity, but you don't pretend it hasn't had a life. David Osei was quiet for a moment. That's a more conservative approach than most restoration clients prefer. Most restoration clients want a showpiece. This car is a historical document. Those aren't the same thing. Another pause. No, they're not. He could hear something shift in Osei's tone. Walk me through the panel treatment you're envisioning. They talked for another 20 minutes about that specifically. By the end, Ethan had the distinct impression that Osei had come into the call prepared to manage a consultant with strong opinions and had discovered instead someone who was thinking about the problem from the same direction he was. That recognition was mutual and unspoken, and it changed the texture of the conversation into something more collaborative and less diplomatic. Isabella said very little for most of the call. She joined from the estate, and when she did speak, it was to ask clarifying questions rather than to redirect. She was learning the language, Ethan realized. She was paying attention to how the technical people talked to each other and filing it away. At the end, after the formal items were concluded and the next steps were established, she said, "Mr. Osei, one request. When the display is designed, the provenance story, the interpretation panels, I want the original discovery to be part of it, not as a footnote." "Of course," Osei said. "The person who found it, and what that required," she said. "That's part of what the car is now." Ethan didn't say anything. "Understood completely," Osei said. After the call ended, Ethan stood in his kitchen with the laptop closed and his coffee gone cold and the sound of Sophie beginning to stir down the hall. The small, specific sounds of a 6-year-old waking up, a cough, a rustling, the creak of her bed frame. He thought about the word document, a historical document. That was what he'd called it to Osei. And he'd meant it in the technical sense, an object that recorded the history of its own making and existence, that held evidence about the people and circumstances and skills that had brought it into being. But standing in the kitchen at 7:50 in the morning, waiting for his daughter to wake up, he thought about it differently. All of it was documentation, in some sense. Carl's letter on the counter, the notebook in the conservation archive waiting to be fully cataloged, the print that had hung on Richard Sterling's office wall for as long as Isabella could remember, the hammer marks in the aluminum that were the physical record of someone's hands and knowledge and intention. The 6 years on Clement Street that were, he saw now, not a gap in the record, but part of it. So, Christmas that year was small, the way it had always been since Sophie was born. They didn't have family nearby. Ethan's parents were in Portland, and their relationship was fine, but not the kind that involved cross-country flights for holidays. Lauren had Sophie on Christmas Eve, and Ethan had her on Christmas Day, which was their arrangement, which mostly worked. He spent Christmas Eve alone in the house for the first time doing something he hadn't done in 6 years. He drew. He'd been a technical illustrator before he was a restorer. Carl had taught him that documentation and drawing were inseparable from understanding, that you didn't truly know an object until you'd tried to render it. He had sketchbooks from his earlier career that he'd kept in a box in the closet, packed away when the business closed, not looked at since. He got the box out that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and opened one of the old sketchbooks and turned to a blank page near the back. He drew the B-04 from memory, not the way it looked now, wrapped and stabilized, awaiting transport, but the way it had looked in the first 15 minutes, in the pale worklight of the storage building, the shape of it against the illumination, the thing that had stopped his feet. He wasn't trying to produce anything useful. He was just trying to return to the moment and stay in it long enough to understand what it had felt like. The recognition, the held breath quality of not yet knowing if you were right. He drew for 3 hours. The sketchbook had 6 pages of the car by the end, different angles, different details, the wheel arch, the C-pillar, the particular lean of the roofline. The last drawing was the simplest, just the outline, just the shape. He looked at it for a while. Then he closed the sketchbook and made dinner and called his parents in Portland, which was a 20-minute conversation that covered the expected topics and ended with his mother saying she'd seen something about a car discovery in a magazine at the dentist's office, and was that him? And him saying yes, and her saying, "Well, that's wonderful, Ethan. We're proud of you." And him saying, "Thank you, Mom," in the voice of someone who meant it more than he would have been comfortable saying directly. After he hung up, he sat in the quiet house and felt the particular shape of a life that was his. Not perfect, not resolved into something clean and finished. The coffee maker still did its 40% thing. The office chair still creaked. Marcus still arrived 7 minutes late, roughly 4 times a week. Sophie still negotiated bedtime with the determination of a labor attorney and the ethics of a pirate. But it was his, and it was real, and he'd done it. Sophie came home on Christmas morning with the specific energy of a 6-year-old who had already opened presents at her mother's house and was experiencing something close to consumer overload, but was committed to maximum engagement anyway. She'd gotten, among other things, a set of art supplies, markers and colored pencils, and a proper sketchbook with thick paper. And she spent most of the morning sitting on the living room floor drawing things with the intense concentration of someone discovering a language. Ethan watched her from the couch, drinking better coffee than usual because he'd bought a bag of the decent kind as a quiet Christmas present to himself. "What are you drawing?" he asked. "The car," she said, without looking up. He looked at the sketchbook in his hands, the drawings he'd done the night before. "Which car?" "Your car, the old one." "It's not my car." "The one you found." She looked up briefly. "Is it going somewhere?" "Detroit. In January." "Is that far?" "About 8 hours by car." She considered this with the geographical pragmatism of someone for whom distance was measured in travel time and snack requirements. "Could we go see it?" "Eventually, when it's been restored and it's on display at the museum." "How long?" "A couple of years." She returned to her drawing. "That's a long time." "Yeah. But then it'll be there forever?" He thought about this. "For a long time. Museums keep things for a long time." "Good," she said. She drew a careful line with a red marker. "It should be somewhere people can see it." He looked at her drawing, the rough shape of a car in red and brown, imprecise in scale, but somehow capturing something about the proportions that surprised him. She'd drawn it low to the ground, with a long hood, in the way that suggested she'd been paying closer attention to his descriptions than he'd realized. "Sophie," he said. "Hmm? How did you know to make it that shape?" She looked at what she'd drawn. "I just remembered what you said it looked like, when you first saw it." She paused. "You said it had a feeling." He stared at her. She went back to drawing. He sat with that for a moment, the word coming back to him across the months and the layers of the story. Richard Sterling saying it about the car, and Isabella repeating it to Ethan in the dark by the storage building. And now here it was again, in his living room, from his 6-year-old daughter, applied back to the first moment. Some words traveled. January came with the transport logistics, which were extensive. The B-04 was moved from the estate on a Tuesday in the second week of the month, in a climate-controlled transport vehicle with the kind of careful loading process that Ethan had overseen on valuable vehicles before and which never stopped being tense, regardless of how many times you'd done it. He was there for the loading. Isabella was there too, though she hadn't said she would be. She arrived 15 minutes before the transport vehicle, which told him she'd been planning to come all along and had decided not to announce it. She was wearing a heavy coat and her hands were in her pockets, and she stood to the side of the activity while the loading happened, watching with the expression of someone making sure something was being handled correctly without wanting to interfere with the handling. When the car was loaded and the transport doors were secured and the team was doing the final documentation checks, she came to stand beside Ethan. "I didn't sleep well," she said. "No? I keep second-guessing. Not the decision, the shape of it, whether I've handled everything correctly." "You have. You can't know that." "I know the parts I was involved in," he said. "Those were handled correctly." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the car being a historical document, that the goal isn't to make it look new." "Yes. I want that to be clear in how it's displayed, not just technically, in the interpretation, the story of how it survived. The rust is part of what it is, not as something that was overcome." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "It makes complete sense." "Osei understands that?" "Osei thought of it before either of us did," Ethan said. "He's been doing this longer than both of us." She let out a breath. "Good." A pause. "I feel like I should say something, as it goes." "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." They stood in comfortable quiet for a moment, the kind that had taken months to arrive at and which neither of them remarked on. "My father would have hated this part," she said, "the letting go of it. He was terrible at letting go of things. But he would have wanted the right outcome." "Yes," she paused. "He would have wanted exactly this." The transport vehicle's engine started. Ethan and Isabella stepped back from the loading area, giving the driver room to maneuver down the estate's long driveway toward the gate. They watched it go. It wasn't dramatic. It was a truck moving down a driveway on a cold January morning, carrying a wrapped object that most people passing on the street outside the gate would have no reason to think twice about. The weight of what it was carrying was invisible from the outside. That was usually how it worked, Ethan thought. The significant things moved through the world without announcing themselves. They looked like ordinary objects in transit until someone who knew what they were looking at happened to stop and pay attention. "Thank you," Isabella said. He looked at her. "For all of it," she said. "From the beginning." A pause. "And for handling the personal parts with care. The notebook. What it meant." She paused. "You didn't have to do that. That wasn't your job." "It was the work," he said, which was what he always said, and which he'd meant differently each time he'd said it, and which by now contained all the meanings at once. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression was different from every other version of her expression he'd catalogued over the months, quieter, less arranged. "I'll see you in Detroit," she said. "Yes." She went back toward the main house, and Ethan stood in the cold driveway until the transport vehicle had fully cleared the gate and turned onto the road and was gone from view. Then he got in his truck and drove to work. The consultancy work with Detroit began properly in February and settled into a rhythm that was uncomfortable for about 3 weeks before it became natural. He drove or flew to Detroit roughly once a month for 3 or 4 days at a time, working directly with Osei's team on the restoration approach. The rest of the time he was on Clement Street, under cars, doing what he'd been doing for 6 years, with phone calls and emails to Detroit threaded through the days at margins that didn't disrupt the work. It was more than he'd expected and less than he'd feared. The two things fit together less neatly than he might have imagined and more functionally than he'd had any right to hope for. Marcus adapted with his usual equanimity, and the part-time hire, a woman named Renata, no relation to Dr. Voss, who was 27 and had worked at 3 shops before this one and was better at electrical systems than either Marcus or Ethan, stabilized the shop's capacity without changing its character. Sophie adapted in the way children adapted, which was by making the new configuration normal with no visible seam. On the mornings Ethan left early for the airport, she accepted his early departure with a brief, business-like hug and the instruction to bring her back something from Detroit, which he did. Small things, a postcard from the museum, a button from the gift shop, once a small die-cast model of a 1960s Italian sports car that bore no specific resemblance to the B04, but that she received with solemn approval and placed on her dresser. "Is that what it's going to look like?" she asked. "When they fix it?" "Something like that, smaller." She picked it up and examined it. "It's pretty." "It is. Even though it's not fixed yet." "Even though it's not fixed yet." She put it back on the dresser with the particular deliberateness of someone placing something exactly right. "That's good," she said. "Pretty things should still be pretty even when they're broken." He looked at her. She went to go find Gerald. He stood in her doorway for a second, thinking about the things children said that hit differently than they had any right to, and about the 6-year-old who kept her ideas to herself until she was sure about them, and about what it meant to raise a person and have that person reflect things back at you that you hadn't known you'd been teaching. The article in Automotive Heritage Quarterly had been the first. It wasn't the last. Over the following months, 3 other publications ran pieces on the B04 discovery and authentication. One of them was a mainstream magazine with a general readership, not a specialist publication, which meant it was written differently. More narrative, more human detail, less technical precision. The journalist called Ethan twice for additional context, and the piece that ran included a photograph taken at the shop, which Ethan had agreed to with some reluctance. The photograph showed him at one of the lifts, mid-work, not looking at the camera. Marcus had been the one to call the photographer over in that moment, saying, "Hey, get him like this." And the photographer had. And the result was the kind of image that looked unconstructed because it actually was. Ethan looked at it in the finished magazine the day it arrived. He looked at the shop behind him, the familiar geometry of the space, the part's wall in the background. He looked like someone doing his job. That was exactly what he was. He put the magazine on the desk next to Carl's letter, which was still there on the corner because he kept meaning to do something with it, and kept deciding it was fine where it was. In March, Carl Bauer died. Not unexpectedly. He'd been in declining health for 2 years, and his daughter had warned Ethan in a brief email in January that things were progressing, but the finality of it landed differently than the anticipation. Ethan found out on a Thursday morning from the same daughter in a message that was kind and brief and included the information that Carl had asked for the AHQ article to be read aloud to him when it came out, which it had been, and that he'd listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was unusual for Carl, and that when it was finished he'd said only, "Good." He got it right. Ethan sat with that for a long time. He thought about a workshop in Stuttgart in 2008, when he was 24 and had arrived with a year of formal training and the specific arrogance of someone who'd been told they were talented and hadn't yet understood what that actually required. Carl had taken one look at his first panel work and said, "You're in a hurry. Things that last are not made in a hurry." He'd said it without cruelty and without softening, the way a person said a true thing to someone they thought could handle the truth. Ethan had been furious for about a week. Then he'd understood. He called Carl's daughter that afternoon and expressed what he meant in the limited and inadequate language that grief made available, and she thanked him and said Carl had spoken of him often and was proud, which was a word Carl had never used directly to Ethan himself, because that wasn't how Carl operated, but which felt true and correct and which Ethan received without deflecting. After he hung up, he went back to work. That was what Carl would have wanted. That was what he wanted, which was the same thing, which said something about how thoroughly a good teacher became part of you. The first phase of the B04's restoration was completed in late April, approximately 4 months after the car arrived in Detroit. Ethan was there for the assessment, which took 2 days and which he and Osei conducted with the methodical care of people who understood that the decisions made now were decisions that would last. The rust was being treated rather than replaced where the underlying metal was structurally sound. The hand-formed aluminum panels, once stabilized and cleaned, revealed the original surface with a clarity that hadn't been visible in the storage building. The slight variations of hand hammering, the compound curves, the particular way the light moved across the metal when you shifted your angle. Osei stood beside him on the second day, both of them looking at the cleaned rear 3/4 panel in the controlled light of the conservation lab. "There it is," Osei said quietly. "Yes." The photograph in the Stellarini archive, the workshop image. Same surface, Ethan said. Same hand. 60 years. 60 years. They were quiet for a moment. You know, Osei said, I've been doing this for a long time. Conservation, restoration, authentication. I've been part of significant discoveries. He paused. This one is different. How? Usually by the time I'm involved, the chain of events is already established. The discovery happened, the authentication happened, the decision about what to do was made. I come in at a defined point. He paused. This one, I feel the full length of it, from the moment you saw it in a storage building to standing here now. He looked at the panel. That's unusual. Ethan thought about 15 minutes under poor lighting, feet stopping for no clean reason, a hand-formed aluminum panel visible under rust that most people would have seen and kept walking. It's a good car, he said. Osei looked at him with a slight expression that was almost a smile. That's a significant understatement. I know, but that's where it starts, with a good car. Isabella came to Detroit in May. She came alone. No assistant, no attorneys, just a flight and a rental car, and the kind of low-profile arrival that suggested she'd decided the visit was personal rather than institutional. She met Ethan and Osei in the conservation lab on a Tuesday morning, and the three of them spent 2 hours going through the restoration progress. She was different in the lab than she'd been at the estate, more open somehow, less managed. She asked questions that showed she'd been reading about the process, real questions, not polite ones. And when Osei walked her through the panel treatment decisions, she listened with the focused attention of someone who wanted to understand, not just be informed. At one point, she put on the gloves Osei offered and touched the cleaned aluminum panel, and the expression on her face was something Ethan had no good word for. Not happiness exactly, more like contact, the particular quality of making physical connection with something that had been abstract. It's warm, she said, which surprised her. Metal holds ambient temperature, Osei said. I know, She paused. I expected it to feel older. The age is in the form, Ethan said, the way it's shaped, not in how it feels under your hand. She looked at him. Like people. He hadn't meant it that way, but once she said it, he couldn't argue with it. They had lunch in the museum cafe, the three of them, which was slightly strange and slightly not. The collision of different registers of this story sitting at a table eating sandwiches and talking about the display timeline. Osei left after lunch for another meeting, which left Ethan and Isabella at the table with the remainder of their coffee. How are you? She asked. It was a simple question that people asked constantly and rarely meant. But the way she asked it indicated she meant it. I'm good, he said. And then because she'd asked genuinely, I lost someone in March, my old teacher, Karl Bauer. I'm sorry, she said. He was the one in Stuttgart? Yes. He paused. He was the person who taught me what it actually meant to know something, what the commitment required. She was quiet for a moment. Did he know about this? She gestured, meaning the car, the lab, all of it. He knew. He was one of the first calls I made. Good, she said. He should have known. He was pleased, Ethan said, in the specific way he was pleased about things, which was very quiet and slightly critical and entirely genuine. She almost smiled. Sounds like someone I would have found difficult to read. Most people did. I had years of practice. The cafe was warm and the afternoon light was coming through the windows at an angle that made everything look temporarily amber, and Ethan thought about how strange it was to be sitting here, in this specific place, across from this specific person, in this specific configuration of circumstances that had assembled itself out of a walk between buildings on a Saturday evening that he'd taken for no particular reason. I've been thinking about the display text, Isabella said. The interpretation panels. What the story says. What are you thinking? That the car is only part of it. The discovery is part of it. But I want the notebook to be represented clearly. Not the personal entries, those are mine, but the act of it, the fact that my grandfather put something in the car that he meant to be found eventually. She paused. I want that to be part of what people understand when they look at it, that the car was carrying something. that the car was keeping something safe until the right moment. He thought about Sophie's drawing on Christmas morning and the word she'd reached for without knowing its history, feeling, and about the way significant things moved through the world without announcing themselves until someone paid the right kind of attention. "That's what the text should say," he said. "Will you help me write it?" He looked at her across the table. She wasn't asking the way people asked when they had the answer already and wanted someone to rubber stamp it. She was asking the way people asked when they needed someone to think alongside them. "Yes," he said. The interpretation text took 3 drafts across 2 months, done largely by email, with one phone call that lasted 90 minutes, and covered not just the text, but tangential things. The right language for a general audience versus a specialist one. What Carl had said about things that lasted. What it meant for Isabella to stand in that storage building and feel her father's absence and her grandfather's presence simultaneously. The final version was shorter than the first draft, which was always the right direction. It said, among other things, that the car had been identified not by a formal authentication team, but by a single person whose knowledge had stayed with him through years of different work, and that this was the discovery's first lesson. That expertise carried in a person did not require constant exhibition to remain present, that it waited, the same way the car waited, for the moment when it was needed. Isabella had written that sentence. Ethan had changed 2 words. He read it on his laptop on a Thursday night at the kitchen table while Sophie did her homework across from him. And he thought it was true, and he thought it was the right thing to say, and he thought Carl would have approved with the specific quiet approval that was Carl's highest register. The exhibition opened on a Friday in October. Ethan drove to Detroit Thursday evening, got a hotel, slept adequately, and arrived at the museum at 9 in the morning, 2 hours before the public opening. The private preview was for the people who'd been part of the process. Osei and his team, Dr. Voss, who had flown from Vienna, James, who had driven from Boston, Dr. Okafor, who was there in her institutional capacity, and who shook Ethan's hand at the entrance with the slightly different handshake of someone who now understood something about him that they hadn't understood when they met. And Isabella, who arrived at 9:15 and found Ethan standing in the entrance to the gallery where the car was displayed and stopped beside him. The B04 was on a low platform, lit from above by lighting that Osei had specified, and the museum's exhibition team had executed correctly. It was not spotlit like a trophy. It was illuminated the way a document was illuminated, fully, evenly, so you could read it. The restoration had stopped where Ethan and Osei had agreed it should stop. The structural integrity was restored. The aluminum panels were cleaned and treated. The surface showed its history. The slight variations of handwork, the areas where time had left marks that weren't damage so much as evidence. It looked like what it was, a 60-year-old object that had been through something and survived and had a story that was visible in its surface if you knew how to look. Around the platform, the interpretation panels, the provenance story, the authentication process, the notebook, represented by a high-resolution reproduction of 2 pages, the opening inscription and the sketch of the car, with a note that the original was in the museum's conservation archive, and the final panel, with the text they'd written together in 3 drafts over 2 months. Isabella read it standing beside him, even though she'd read it in draft 8 times. "It's right," she said. "Yes." She looked at the car. "My father would have stood here for a long time." "How long?" "Until someone had to come get him for something." A pause. "He was like that with things he cared about. He didn't rush them." Ethan thought about Richard Sterling standing in a storage building with a car he couldn't fully identify, knowing it had a feeling, keeping it safe for 20 years without fully knowing why. "He did a good job," Ethan said. She looked at him. "With the car," he said. "He kept it intact. That mattered." She looked back at the B04. "He did a lot of things imperfectly," she said. "He and we were still working things out when he died. There are things I would have said differently, things I wish I'd—" She stopped. "That's how it is, I think, for most people. You don't get the clean ending." "No. You get the actual one." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "But this She gestured at the car, the display, the room. This is something finished, not by him, not by me alone, but finished. He looked at the car on its platform, in its proper light, with its story told correctly on the walls around it. Yes, he said, it is. The museum opened at 11. People came in, not the vast crowds of a major blockbuster exhibition, but the steady, engaged flow of people who had come specifically, who had read about it or heard about it, or worked in the field and understood what they were looking at. Ethan watched them move around the platform, watched their faces, watched the particular quality of attention that the car seemed to draw from people when they understood what they were seeing. He saw a man spend 12 minutes looking at the rear three-quarter panel without moving. He saw a woman read the interpretation text twice, then take a photograph of the final panel. He saw a teenager, maybe 16, maybe younger, crouching near the front wheel arch, looking at the surface treatment with the focused expression of someone who had not yet learned to perform engagement, who was just genuinely seeing something. That last one he watched for longer than the others. He drove home on Saturday morning. 8 hours, roughly, Detroit to the city, stopping once for gas and coffee and a stretch at a rest area somewhere in Ohio where the November sky was doing its thing. Low clouds, gray light, the specific palette of the Midwest in fall that was either depressing or beautiful depending on what you were bringing to it. He called Sophie from the car at hour 4. She picked up with the specific chaos of a Saturday morning at her mother's house in the background. Television, some kind of disagreement being resolved in another room, the general ambient noise of a household that was not his. Dad. Hey, how's everything? Good. Did the museum open? Yesterday. It was good. Was the car there? The car was there. Did people like it? People were very interested in it. She considered this. Did anyone stay for a long time looking at it? He thought about the man and the 12 minutes. Yes. Good, she said. That's what you're supposed to do with things that matter. He drove for a while after she hung up, through the Ohio landscape, through the low gray light, thinking about a 6-year-old who kept her ideas to herself until she was sure about them, and who had, at some point in the last year, developed a philosophy of attention that he hadn't taught her directly, but which had arrived in her anyway through whatever channel things arrived through. The knowing didn't require constant exhibition to remain present. It waited. He got home at 4 in the afternoon to a house that was empty and quiet, in the specific way of a house waiting to be occupied again. He made coffee from the machine that still did its 40% thing, stood at the counter drinking it, and looked at Carl's letter still in the corner of the counter. He picked it up. He read it again. He'd read it probably 15 times since December. He'd had it memorized for months. But he read it again anyway, standing in his kitchen in the late afternoon light, because some things were worth returning to regardless of how well you knew them. The important thing is the knowing, what you carry with you that allows you to recognize what you're seeing when you see it. That is earned. He put the letter down. He went to the closet and got the sketchbook, the one from Christmas Eve, the drawings of the car. He sat at the kitchen table and opened it and looked at the last drawing. Just the outline. Just the shape that had stopped his feet in a gap between buildings on a Saturday evening 9 months ago. He turned to a fresh page. He picked up a pencil. He didn't have a particular object in mind. He wasn't documenting anything or illustrating anything or working toward a specific result. He just started drawing, the way you started a conversation when you didn't have an agenda, when you just wanted to see where it went. The pencil moved. Sophie came through the door at 5:30, carried in by the noise of Lauren's car pulling away outside, and she dumped her bag and her coat in the hall with the specific economy of someone who has been maintaining tidiness all day somewhere else and is done with that now. And she came into the kitchen and stopped when she saw him at the table. "You're drawing," she said. "Yeah." She came to look over his shoulder. She studied the sketchbook for a moment with the same focused expression she brought to the die-cast model on her dresser. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "I just started." She thought about this. "That's okay," she said. "Sometimes you have to start before you know." She went to get a snack from the cabinet, and he listened to the familiar sounds of the kitchen being occupied. The cabinet opening, the crinkle of something, the refrigerator checking and closing. And he thought about everything that had happened in the last 9 months, and what it added up to, and whether there was a clean statement of what it meant. There wasn't, because clean statements were usually wrong, or at least incomplete. What there was instead was this: a car that had waited in the dark for the right person, and a person who had carried the right knowledge without knowing when he'd need it, and a family whose unfinished business had become, through a chain of improbable events, something visible and complete and properly told. And a 6-year-old who had drawn the car in red and brown on Christmas morning and understood something about it that had taken the adults considerably longer to articulate. What there was Clement Street and Detroit and Stuttgart and the weight of Carl's letter and the particular quiet of a house settling into evening. What there was the work. The ongoing, ordinary, irreplaceable work. Sophie sat down across from him with her snack and got out her own sketchbook, the one with the thick paper, and opened it to a fresh page. "Can we draw together?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, "we can draw together." They sat at the kitchen table in the November light, father and daughter, and they drew. Neither of them talked about what they were drawing. They didn't need to. Some things you recognized without being told.